Welcome to Dickensian Sleep Story, where the streets are softly lit, the rain is gentle, and even the great city seems to breathe a little slower for you. Settle yourself in as you are, let the day loosen its grip. Take a slow breath in through your nose, and let it fall out again, easy as a sigh. If your jaw has been working too hard, allow it to unclench. Let your tongue rest. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, as if a warm hand has reminded them they needn't hold the world up tonight. Feel the weight of your blankets, how they settle, how they make a small, safe country around you. Another breath, unhurried. And another, as though you've all the time in London, and London will wait. As you sink a little deeper into comfort, I wonder, where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps you're by a window, perhaps by a lamp, perhaps in the quiet middle of a room that belongs only to rest. If these Victorian sleep stories bring you comfort, you're warmly invited to subscribe. And now, let the world beyond your bed fade to a pleasant hush while we step into a rainy November night, into fog and gaslight, into the warm promise of a hearth, and into Holborn, where cobblestones shine like dark glass beneath the lamps. In Victorian London, in a Dickensian drift of fog and gaslight with rain whispering on stone, this sleep story begins as softly as a turned page. The city is a great, listening creature tonight, quiet at the edges, warm in pockets, and kind enough, if you look closely, to offer small mercies to those who keep walking. Holborn lay beneath a veil of mist that made each street lamp wear a halo. The rain did not fall in any rude fashion. It simply tapped and brushed, like careful fingers on a door that knew it would be opened. Wheels hissed as a carriage passed, and the sound seemed to vanish into the fog before it could properly echo. Somewhere a bell marked an hour that felt more like a suggestion than a command. Alfred Alfie Crane kept to the edge of the pavement, where the runoff made thin, shining streams along the curb. He was 14, perhaps 16 on days, when he stood very straight, and he carried that weary, careful air that belongs to boys who have been useful for too long. His cap was pulled low, his coat was too light for November, and his hands, red at the knuckles, held tight to the strap of a small messenger satchel, as if it might otherwise float away into the fog. He had finished most of his errands. There had been parcels wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, letters sealed and stamped, and one particularly fussy delivery to a gentleman who opened his door only wide enough to frown. Alfie had endured it all with the same quiet steadiness he brought to everything. It was not pride, exactly, that made him want to do his work well. It was longing. He wished, very simply, to complete one last errand that left someone feeling safely cared for, one last small act that might make the day seem gentler than it had been. He told himself he ought to go home. His lodging was not much a narrow bed, a thin blanket, a corner that smelled faintly of boiled cabbage from the kitchen below, but it was his, and it was dry. Yet his feet kept moving, as if they were searching for something his mind had not named. Then, as he passed a narrow bookshop doorway set back from the street, he saw it. At first it looked like a curled shaving of silver on the dark, wet stone, nothing at all, a mere glimmer where the lamplight pooled. But Alfie's eye was trained by necessity. He could spot a dropped coin at 20 paces. He could read a hurried address by the blur of ink. He paused beneath the bookshop's sheltering step, where the doorway offered a sliver of dryness, and bent down. It was not a coin. It was a spring thin, bright, and delicately coiled, like a ribbon of metal that had learned to dance. It lay in a neat spiral, its end slightly frayed where it had snapped free. Alfie lifted it carefully between finger and thumb. Even in the dimness, it seemed to hold a kind of intention, as if it belonged to something that once made a small, private music. A music box spring, Alfie thought, surprised at himself for knowing. Once, a lodger in the house where he ran errands had shown him a little box with a painted lid, and when it was wound, a tune had chimed out thin and sweet, like a bird calling in a warm room. The lodger had laughed at Alfie's wide eyes and said, "That's the spring doing the work, lad. The heart of it." The heart of it. Alfie turned the coil gently, feeling its faint resilience. He imagined a music box somewhere in London, silent now, its lid perhaps opened by someone expecting comfort, only to find stillness. The rain pattered in the gutter, the fog pressed close, and Alfie's longing, which had been vague a moment ago, settled into something clear and tender. He would return it. It was, strictly speaking, not his business. The sensible thing would be to hand it to a constable, or leave it on the bookshop counter with a note, But Alfie had lived long enough with the city to know how easily small things disappeared. A lost button became a lost coat. A lost penny became an empty supper. A lost music box spring well. It might become a lost comfort, and Alfie did not like the thought of that. He slipped the spring into his satchel as if it were a fragile letter, and stepped back into the rain. He had not gone 10 paces before a voice came from the fog at his elbow, cheerful, conspiratorial, and altogether too lively for a wet November night. "Now then, what's this? Are Alfie Crane collecting silver worms off the pavement?" Alfie stopped, not startled so much as resigned, as one might be resigned to the weather. Out of the mist stepped a boy a little older than Alfie, slim and quick as a thought, his coat hanging on him with a certain rakish confidence that made it look like a choice rather than a shortage. He wore his hat at an angle that suggested it had been taught manners by nobody at all. His eyes were bright, and his grin had a way of turning the world into a joke it would be rude to refuse. Jack Dawkins, known to almost everyone as the Artful Dodger, tipped his hat with elaborate courtesy, as if they were meeting in a drawing room rather than a damp street in Holborn. "It's raining polite tonight," Dodger went on, as though reviewing the weather for a newspaper. "Not like them nasty downpours that slap you about. This one's more like a lady tapping your sleeve." Alfie could not help the smallest smile. "Evening, Dodger." "Evening indeed," said Dodger, falling into step beside him with the ease of a cat deciding a lap was available. "And where are you bound, if I may be so bold? Home, or out on some noble mission, looking like a saint who's mislaid his halo and is going back to fetch it?" Alfie walked on. Dodger walked with him. The rain made a soft percussion on their caps. "It's nothing," Alfie said. "Nothing's always something," Dodger replied at once, "especially when it's held like it matters." Alfie hesitated. Dodger's sharp eyes had noticed the careful way Alfie kept his satchel close, the slight protectiveness in his posture. Dodger, for all his bright talk, was observant in a way that felt oddly respectful. He noticed, and he did not mock cruelly. He merely made the noticing sound like a compliment. Alfie glanced up at the nearest lamp. Its glow blurred in the fog, turning the world into a lantern-lit painting. "It's a spring," he admitted quietly. "For a music box. I found it by the bookshop step." Dodger's eyebrows rose as if a curtain had gone up on a stage. "A music box spring? Ooh, listen to you talking like a clockmaker." Alfie stopped beneath the next lamp and opened his satchel just enough to show the coil. Dodger leaned in, careful not to let the rain drip inside, and made a low, appreciative sound. "Well now," he said, softer than before. "Ain't that a pretty little thing? Like a ribbon that forgot it was meant for hair." "It's broken off," Alfie said. "Someone will be missing it." Dodger straightened, and for a moment his face, usually all quick jokes, took on an earnestness that made him look older. "You're right there," he said. "Somebody'll open their little box, and it'll be quiet as a church at midnight. That's no good." Alfie's throat tightened slightly. It was exactly what he had imagined. Dodger tapped his chin. "So," he said briskly, as if they were businessmen negotiating a contract, "we return it. To who?" "That's the trouble," Alfie confessed. "It could be anyone." Dodger's grin returned, but gentler. "Anyone is still someone. London's full of 'em. We just have to find the right one." Alfie gave a small, helpless shrug. "How?" Dodger pointed with a gloved finger toward a side street, where the fog thickened like cream. "First, we get you out of this rain a moment. There's a little chapel gatehouse, not far an alcove, proper dry, and the old fellow who minds it likes a bit of company. Then we think." Alfie blinked. "A chapel?" Dodger spread his hands. "Don't look so shocked. A boy can't point at a chapel without being accused of sainthood these days." In spite of himself, Alfie let out a quiet breath of laughter. It felt good in his chest, like warmth. They turned down the side street, where the cobbles were darker and the lamps fewer. The city seemed to lean closer here, the buildings tall and patient, their windows dim with curtains drawn. Rain threaded down drainpipes, and somewhere a cat made a sleepy complaint. At the end of the lane stood a small chapel, modest, rather than grand, with a gatehouse at its side. The gatehouse had an alcove set into the wall, half hidden by ivy that shivered under the rain. A lantern burned there, its flames steady behind cloudy glass. Dodger guided Alfie under the alcove as if ushering him into a private room. The air smelled faintly of damp stone and old wax. A little shelf held a stub of candle, and a tin cup that looked as if it had been warmed by many hands over many evenings. An elderly man sat just within the gatehouse door, his chair angled so he could see both the street and the chapel yard. He wore a thick shawl and held a book open on his lap, though his eyes were half closed, as if he were reading with memory rather than sight. At the sound of footsteps, he opened his eyes and smiled in a way that made the night feel kinder. "Well," he said, voice mild as milk, "if it isn't the rain bringing me visitors again." Dodger bowed with an extravagance that made Alfie's cap feel suddenly too plain. "Evening, Mr. Sallow," he said. "We've fetched you 2 fine specimens of damp boyhood, and we're wondering if you've got any wisdom to spare." Mr. Sallow chuckled. "Wisdom? I've got a little. Most of it second-hand, like my coat. Come in, stand out of the drip." Alfie stepped further under the shelter. The lantern's glow made the wet world beyond look softer, as if the fog were a curtain and they were safe behind it. "Thank you, sir," Alfie murmured. "Polite," said Mr. Sallow approvingly. "Politeness is a fine umbrella. Doesn't stop the rain, but it makes you feel less drenched." Dodger winked at Alfie as if to say, "See, told you." And then, from the chapel yard itself, came the faint sound of a gate opening quiet hinges, careful hands. A figure appeared in the mist, carrying a small bundle under his coat to keep it dry. He was slight, pale in the lamplight, and moved with the thoughtful caution of someone who did not wish to disturb the night. Oliver Twist. Alfie had met Oliver only a few times, and each time he had felt the same strange ease in Oliver's presence, as if kindness were not a rare thing after all, but merely something that needed noticing. Oliver's eyes, when he looked up and saw them, held that steady gentleness that made even a cold street feel less lonely. "Good evening," Oliver said softly, stepping into the circle of light. "The rain is still at it, I see." "It's having a lovely time," Dodger replied. "Doing its little dance all over London." Oliver smiled, small but real, and glanced at Alfie. "Are you all right, Alfie?" Alfie nodded, and felt the tightness in his throat loosen a little. "Yes," he said. I found something." Oliver's gaze sharpened with quiet interest, never greedy, never pressing. "Found?" he echoed, as if the word itself carried a story. Alfie opened his satchel and showed the music box spring in his palm. The coil caught the lantern light and shone like a sliver of moon. Oliver's face softened. "Oh," he breathed, as if he recognized the sort of thing it belonged to, if not the exact object. "Someone must be missing it." "That's what I said," Alfie replied, and was surprised by how glad he felt to have Oliver agree. "I want to return it." Mr. Sallow leaned forward, peering. "A delicate piece," he murmured. "Not made for puddles and pockets." Dodger folded his arms. "So we're taking counsel, sir, me and Alfie. We got no name, no address, no nothing, just a twist of silver and a boy with a conscience." Oliver glanced at Dodger with affectionate reproach. "A conscience is a fine thing," he said, "and I think Alfie's is a good one." Dodger put a hand to his chest. "Hear that? I'm in the company of angels. It's a wonder I don't sprout wings." Oliver's eyes warmed. "If you sprouted wings, Dodger, you'd only use them to avoid puddles." "Exactly," Dodger said triumphantly. "A practical miracle." The 4 of them, Alfie, Dodger, Oliver, and Mr. Sallow, stood in the lantern's glow, and for a moment the rain felt far away, as if it were happening to another city. Oliver looked down at the spring again. "May I?" he asked gently. Alfie placed it in Oliver's hand. Oliver held it with careful fingers, turning it slightly as though listening for a tune trapped inside. "My goodness," Oliver said, almost to himself. "It's like a tiny ribbon, as Dodger says. Do you know, I think I've seen something like it at Mr. Fagin's shop." Alfie's head lifted. "Fagin's?" Dodger's grin returned, pleased at the sound. "Ah, there you are, the old wonder shop. If there's a home for odd bits and gentle mysteries, it's there." Mr. Sallow hummed thoughtfully. "Fagin," he said, not with any fear, but with the fond tone one might use for an eccentric neighbour. "He does mend what others throw away. A curious sort of mercy, that." Oliver nodded. "He has a way of making broken things seem not shameful," he said softly, as if they're only waiting. Alfie's longing stirred again, stronger now. The thought of a place where broken things were welcomed felt like a kind of answer. "Would he know who it belongs to?" Alfie asked. Oliver considered. "Perhaps not at once, but he might recognize the make of it. Or we might be able to fix it to its box if we find the box. And Oliver's eyes lifted to Alfie's face, steady and kind. If you wish to return it, we can help you. Dodger put an arm around Alfie's shoulders, not heavy, just a brief, friendly hook. You hear that? You've enlisted the finest guidance in Holborn. Me for directions, Oliver for virtue, Mr. Sallow for wisdom, and you for the noble errand. We'll have London stitched up neat as a seamstress's hem. Mr. Sallow smiled. You might begin by keeping out of the worst puddles, he advised. And if you're going to Holborn by way of the wider streets, you may want to pause somewhere warm. The river air grows colder as the night deepens. The river? Alfie repeated, puzzled. Oliver's gaze drifted beyond the alcove, as if he could see through fog to the city's bones. Sometimes, he said, people gather in warm corners near the water where a kettle can simmer and the talk stays quiet. If someone lost a music box spring, it might have been in a place like that. A music box is the sort of thing brought out when the world feels too heavy. Dodger snapped his fingers. A riverside tavern corner, he said. Yes. There's one I know soft as a pillow if you keep to the right side, near the kettle. They don't like rowdy sorts, so you're safe, Alfie. Your solemn face would make a rowdy man apologize. Alfie felt himself blush faintly. I'm not solemn, he protested. Dodger leaned in. You're solemn adjacent. Oliver laughed quietly, and the sound was like warmth in a cup. Alfie looked at the spring now back in his palm, and then at the three faces around him in the lantern light. This was not how he had imagined his last errand. He had expected to walk alone through wet streets, perhaps to knock on a door and be turned away. Instead, he had company, and the city, which could so often feel hard, was just for tonight turning soft. All right, Alfie said, and surprised himself with the steadiness in his voice. We'll go to Mr. Fagin's shop. And, if the tavern might help, we can go there too. Mr. Sallow nodded approvingly. There's sense, he said, and heart, a fine combination. Dodger straightened his hat as if preparing for a grand expedition. Come along then, he said, and made a sweeping gesture toward the fog. Follow me, and don't step where the puddles look deepest. Puddles are liars, they pretend to be shallow, and then steal your socks. Oliver tucked his bundle closer under his coat, and Alfie noticed, as they stepped back into the rain, that Oliver had been carrying a small loaf wrapped in cloth. For the gatehouse, Oliver explained softly, catching Alfie's glance. Mr. Sallow always forgets to eat when he's reading. Mr. Sallow made a mock sigh. Exposed, he said. Completely exposed. Dodger wagged a finger. See, Alfie, that's Oliver Twist for you. He feeds the world and then pretends it's nothing. Oliver's cheeks coloured modestly. It is nothing, he said. Just a loaf. But Alfie understood. It wasn't the loaf. Not really. It was the way Oliver remembered. They set off through Holborn, three boys moving together beneath a sky that seemed made of wet velvet. The fog softened the edges of everything. A lamplighter up the street lifted his pole, and the flame bloomed inside a glass lantern with a quiet, golden sigh. The light fell across the cobbles, and the puddles became mirrors. Alfie walked between Oliver and Dodger, and felt strangely less cold. Dodger kept up a low stream of talk, partly to amuse himself, partly to keep Alfie from slipping into silence. He spoke of how fog made everyone look mysterious, even Mr. Sallow, and he's about as mysterious as a teapot. He spoke of how the rain polished London so it looked respectable for once. He spoke of a book he had once tried to read only once, and how the words had marched about, like little soldiers refusing to be friendly. Oliver listened with fond patience, occasionally adding a gentle correction when Dodger's exaggerations grew too splendid. Alfie listened too, letting the talk wash over him like warm water, while his fingers, inside his satchel, kept checking the spring as if to reassure himself it was still there. They passed the narrow bookshop doorway again, and Alfie glanced at the sheltered step. The stone was empty now, as if the spring had never been there at all. The shop window showed rows of spines, brown, green, faded red like quiet faces in a crowd. A candle burned inside, and the scent of paper and binding glue seemed, somehow, to reach Alfie even through the glass. Books are like beds, Dodger murmured, startling Alfie with the unexpected thoughtfulness. You climb in, and next thing you know it's morning and you've dreamt about places you've never been. Oliver smiled at that. That's rather lovely, Dodger. Dodger cleared his throat. Don't repeat it, he said quickly. I've got a reputation to maintain. They turned onto a broader street, where the sound of the city deepened, hooves on stone, a distant call, the soft clatter of a cart. Yet even here, the fog made everything gentle. It was as if London had been wrapped in wool. As they approached the direction of the river, the air changed. It grew cooler and carried a faint metallic scent, like damp iron. The lamps seemed to glow paler, and the mist thickened into long, drifting ribbons. "There," Dodger said, pointing ahead. "That's the place." A tavern stood near the riverside, nothing grand, nothing rowdy. Its windows were small and steamed from within. Light leaked out in honey-coloured squares, and the door opened now and then to release a breath of warmth and the faint, comforting smell of something simmering. Dodger guided them not into the main room, but toward a corner near the side entrance, where a narrow passage led to a snug little space, half pantry, half-sitting nook kept warm by a small stove. A kettle sat there, quietly singing to itself. A woman with a thick apron and a kindly, tired face looked up as they approached. "Dodger," she said, not unkindly, though her tone suggested she had said his name in exasperation before. "You're dripping." "It's the fashion," Dodger replied, bowing. "May we borrow a corner? We've got a delicate mission. Very respectable." Oliver gave a small nod, polite. "Good evening, ma'am." The woman's eyes softened at once. "Evening, love," she said to Oliver, and then her gaze shifted to Alfie, quiet, earnest, wet to the bone. "And who's this?" Alfie cleared his throat. "Alfie Crane," he said. "I'm a messenger." "A messenger," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "Well, come in then. Stand by the stove. Warm your hands. The kettle's friendly." Alfie stepped into the nook, and the heat touched his fingers like relief. The kettle's simmering sound was steady and soothing, like a heartbeat. Dodger leaned in toward the woman and lowered his voice theatrically. "We're looking for someone who's lost a music box spring." The woman blinked. "A what?" Alfie opened his satchel and showed the coil. In the tavern's lamplight, it looked even more delicate, more clearly a piece of something meant for beauty. The woman's expression changed. She did not recognize it exactly, but the sight of it stirred something in her memory. "Well," she said slowly, "I can't say I've seen that bit. But," she wiped her hands on her apron, thinking, "there was a gentleman in here earlier, sat right where you're standing. Quiet sort. Had a little wooden box out, no bigger than a man's palm. He was winding it and listening like it was telling him a secret." Oliver's eyes brightened with gentle interest. "Did it play?" "It did," the woman said. "A little tune. Soft. Made the room sound kinder, if you know what I mean. Then the lid slipped, I think. Or he fumbled. His hands were stiff from the cold and something pinged. He looked down and went pale as paper. He searched about, but the floorboards in that corner are old and tricky. Things can vanish between them." Alfie felt a flutter in his chest. "What did he look like?" he asked. The woman tilted her head. "Older," she said. "Not ancient, but worn. A scarf pulled up round his chin. A kind face, though sad in the eyes. He paid for his tea, thanked me proper, and said he'd have to go back without it." Oliver's voice was very soft. "Did he say where he was going?" The woman shook her head. "Only that he had a stop to make near Holborn. Something about a little gatehouse where he liked to sit, when the weather wasn't too wicked." Mr. Sallow's gatehouse, Alfie thought at once. Dodger gave Alfie a quick look, triumphant but gentle. "See?" he whispered. "London's a quilt. You pull one thread, and the rest comes along." Alfie's fingers tightened around the spring. The idea of a sad, kind-eyed gentleman leaving without his tune made Alfie's longing sharpen into purpose. Oliver spoke to the woman with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "You've been very helpful." She waved a hand, embarrassed by praise. "It's nothing," she said. "You boys stay warm a moment. There's tea left in the kettle. Pour yourselves a cup, mind it's hot." Dodger's eyes widened as if he'd been offered a crown. "Tea," he whispered reverently. And then, to Alfie, "Now we are truly on a noble mission." They drank in the nook 3 cups, shared between them, the steam rising like a small, private fog. Alfie held his cup in both hands, letting the warmth seep into his palms. The tea tasted of comfort more than anything else, slightly bitter, slightly sweetened, and utterly real. Oliver ate a small piece of his loaf and offered the rest to the woman for later. Dodger, in an unusual moment of restraint, did not steal any biscuits, though his eyes mourned their absence. When they stepped back outside, the rain had eased to a softer patter, as if satisfied. The fog still lay thick, but the lamps shone through it like patient stars. "So," Dodger said, rubbing his hands, "we got ourselves a kind-faced gentleman, a small wooden box, and a missing spring. Next stop, the gatehouse." Oliver nodded, but his gaze went a little distant, thoughtful. "If he sits there," Oliver said softly, "perhaps he'll be there again tonight. If the music meant something to him, he might come back even in the rain." Alfie's heart beat a little faster. "And if we can't find him there?" Dodger lifted his chin. "Then we go to Fagin," he said, as if it were the most certain thing in the world. "Because if anyone can coax a story out of a broken bit of silver, it's him." They walked back through the wet streets, turning away from the river's chill and toward Holborn's familiar stones. The city seemed quieter now, as though the hour had nudged London closer to sleep. A few late walkers passed hunched figures under umbrellas, a woman carrying a covered basket, a man with a collar turned up so high his face disappeared. Alfie felt himself settling into the rhythm of the night. Step, breath, lamp glow, rain. The spring in his satchel seemed to pulse with possibility. When they reached the chapel gatehouse, the lantern was still burning, steady as a promise. Mr. Sallow had shifted in his chair and was now sipping something from the tin cup. His book closed, waiting as though he had known they would return. "And here come my damp philosophers," he said, pleased. "Have you solved London?" Dodger made a grand gesture. "Nearly," he said. "We found the tale's middle." Oliver explained gently, and Alfie listened as if hearing his own purpose spoken aloud. The kind-faced gentleman, the little wooden box, the missing tune. Mr. Sallow nodded slowly, his eyes softening. "A music box," he murmured. "Ah, yes. I have seen him." Alfie's breath caught. "You have?" Mr. Sallow leaned back, remembering. "He comes on certain evenings," he said. "Stands just there by the gate, listens to the quiet, and sometimes, when the weather permits, he plays a tune. Not loud, just enough for the air to hold it. It's a comfort, I think, for him and for the night." Oliver's voice was tender. "Does he have a name?" Mr. Sallow smiled faintly. "He told me once. Mr. Avery." "A clerk," he said, "though he looks like a man who has outlived a great many papers and numbers. He has a way of speaking to the lamp as if it were an old friend." Dodger whispered to Alfie. "I do that too sometimes, when I've had a lot of feelings and nowhere to put 'em." Alfie's eyes stung unexpectedly, and he blinked hard, blaming the rain. "Is he here tonight?" Alfie asked. Mr. Sallow shook his head. "Not yet, but he may come. If he lost his spring, he may feel drawn here, as you have been." He looked at Alfie kindly. "You carry the missing piece. Perhaps you are meant to meet." Oliver laid a gentle hand on Alfie's sleeve light as a feather, steady as a promise. "If he comes," Oliver said, "you can give it back, and if he does not, we can still take it to Mr. Fagin. Either way, you will have done a good thing." Alfie swallowed and nodded. They waited in the gatehouse alcove, warm enough beneath the lantern, listening to the city's softened sounds. The rain made its quiet music on the stone. A clock somewhere, perhaps in a nearby shop, perhaps in a distant church, ticked steadily, each click like a small reassurance. Dodger, for once, spoke less. He leaned against the wall and watched the fog as if it were a theatre curtain. Oliver sat on the edge of the step and held his hands together, as though keeping warmth safely cupped. Alfie stood with his satchel against his chest, feeling the spring inside like a heartbeat. Minutes passed unhurried, as if time itself had put on slippers. Then a figure appeared at the edge of the fog. He walked slowly, carefully, like a man who had learned not to rush the world. His scarf was pulled high, his coat worn but neat. When he came into the lantern's glow, Alfie saw a face that matched the tavern woman's description. Kind, lined, with eyes that looked tired in a gentle way, as though they had been holding memories for a long time. Mr. Avery paused by the gate, and for a moment he simply stood there, listening to the rain, to the faint hush of London. Then he reached into his pocket and drew out a small wooden box. Alfie's breath held itself. Mr. Avery opened the lid with careful fingers. He turned the winding key once, twice, then stopped. His hands hovered, his face tightened with a quiet sadness, and he shut the lid again as if the sight of the silent box was too much to bear. Oliver rose smoothly. He did not approach like a stranger. He approached like a friend not yet met. "Good evening, sir," Oliver said gently. Mr. Avery startled slightly, then relaxed when he saw Oliver's open expression. "Good evening," he replied, voice mild. "I didn't think anyone would be about. We were keeping Mr. Sallow company," Oliver said, nodding toward the gatehouse. "He said you sometimes come here." Mr. Avery's eyes softened at the mention of Mr. Sallow. "Aye," he said. "It's a quiet place. The lantern feels steady." Dodger stepped forward then, unable to resist performing a little. "Steady as a saint," he said cheerfully. "And kinder than a landlord, which is saying something." Mr. Avery blinked, then a small smile tugged at his mouth, surprised into existence. "And who might you be?" he asked. Dodger bowed. "Jack Dawkins, at your service, known to polite society as the Artful Dodger, but tonight I'm merely a humble guide on a mission of mercy." Mr. Avery looked from Dodger to Oliver, bemused. "A mission?" he echoed. Alfie stepped forward, heart pounding, and opened his satchel with hands that trembled slightly from more than cold. He drew out the music box spring and held it out on his palm. "I found this," Alfie said quietly, "by a bookshop step in Holborn. We heard someone lost a spring at the Riverside Tavern. I thought it might be yours." Mr. Avery stared at the coil as if it were a miracle. For a moment he did not move. Then, very slowly, as though afraid the night might take it back, he reached out and lifted the spring between his fingers. His breath caught. "That's it," he whispered, not loudly enough for the fog to hear. "That's my poor little spring." Oliver's voice was warm with relief. "Oh, I'm glad." Mr. Avery looked up at Alfie, and something in his eyes shone gratitude. Yes, but also the quiet astonishment of a person who has not expected kindness to arrive so directly. "You went to trouble," Mr. Avery said softly. "For this?" Alfie shook his head. "It wasn't trouble," he murmured, though the truth was it had been effort, and cold, and damp. But it had also been something else, something worth it. Mr. Avery's fingers curled gently around the spring. "You don't know," he began, and then stopped, as if the weight of the explanation might spoil the delicacy of the moment. Dodger, to his credit, lowered his voice. "If it matters," he said, "we like things that matter, even little things." Mr. Avery smiled faintly. "It's a tune," he said, almost apologetic. "A tune my wife liked, when the world was different. I wind it when I can, and for a minute the rain sounds like music, and the fog feels less heavy. Silly, isn't it?" Oliver's eyes were very gentle. "It doesn't sound silly," he said. "It sounds like love." Mr. Avery swallowed, and nodded once, his throat working. Alfie felt his own chest ache with a soft, hopeful warmth. "But," Mr. Avery said, looking down at the spring, "I don't know if I can fix it back. I tried to find it and failed. I'm no craftsman." Dodger snapped his fingers softly, as if remembering a candle in a dark room. "That's where Fagin comes in," he said. "He's got a shop full of clever hands and kinder curiosity than anyone will admit." Mr. Avery hesitated. "Fagin," he said slowly, as if tasting the name. "I have heard of him. A curiosity shop in Holborn." "The very one," Oliver said, nodding. "He mends things. Not just objects sometimes. Other things too." Mr. Avery's gaze moved between them, the earnest messenger boy, the gentle young man, the lively guide with a softened grin, and the old gatehouse keeper watching like a lantern himself. "You would take me there?" Mr. Avery asked, quietly incredulous. Alfie's longing, his wish to deliver one last errand that left someone safely cared for, rose up and settled into certainty. "Yes," Alfie said, "if you'd like." Mr. Avery's smile deepened, small but true. "Then, yes," he said, "I'd like." And so, with the rain continuing its polite tapping and the fog wrapping the lamps in halos, the little group set out together, walking not quickly, not urgently, but with the calm purpose of people carrying something gentle through the night. They did not hurry, there was no need to hurry, not for this sort of errand, which was made of quiet care rather than alarm. The rain, too, seemed to approve of their pace, keeping itself to a light, steady tapping, as if it wished to accompany them without insisting upon attention. Mr. Avery walked beside Alfie, holding the little wooden music box close beneath his coat, like a shy animal that preferred warmth. Now and then his fingers brushed the pocket where the spring rested, as if to reassure himself it was truly there. Oliver stayed on his other side, a calm presence in the mist, and Dodger ranged half a step ahead, pointing out the driest parts of the pavement with the solemnity of a guide leading travellers through a desert. "That bit there's a puddle in disguise," Dodger warned, touching Alfie's sleeve to steer him away. "Looks innocent, but it's got ambitions," Alfie obeyed, and felt oddly grateful for such practical guardianship. Under the gaslight, the cobbles shone like sealed ink, and the fog rolled low as a blanket dragged along the ground by invisible hands. As they turned back toward Holborn's older lanes, the city seemed to fold around them, buildings leaning in with the weary affection of tall relations. Windows were curtained, doorways stood dark and patient. Somewhere, behind brick and plaster, a fire crackled softly, an unseen hearth making its own small sun. Dodger, in the spirit of keeping everyone's spirits buoyant, talked of nothing and everything. A hat he'd once seen that was so tall it could have housed a family of sparrows. A cat that had tried to follow him home out of pure admiration. And a baker who claimed his rolls were so fresh they'd start opinions if you left. Alone. Mr. Avery listened with a faint, surprised smile, as though he'd forgotten that the world still contained boys who could speak so freely. Oliver listened too, occasionally laughing in that quiet way that seemed to warm the air. Alfie said little, but he felt his chest easing, as if the night were loosening knots he hadn't known he carried. They turned into a narrower street where the fog thickened and the gas lamps made amber pools on the stones. There, tucked between a tobacconist's and a shop that sold ribbons and pins, was a window crowded with objects that seemed to have gathered like curious guests at a party. Silver spoons, cracked porcelain dolls, brass compasses, a tarnished miniature frame, and a wooden box with painted flowers whose colours had softened with age. Above the door hung a sign, hand-painted and slightly crooked, as if it had been hung by someone more interested in the view than the line. Fagin's Curiosities. Warmth breathed out from the seams of the door, carrying the scent of old wood, tea, and something faintly sweet orange peel, perhaps, or a cinnamon stick simmering somewhere out of sight. The lamplight inside was not harsh. It was the colour of honey, and it made the fog beyond look colder by comparison, like a world seen through glass. Dodger pushed the door open with the flourish of a man announcing royalty. "Home," he declared, though he did not mean it in the legal sense, only in the sense that this was a place that knew his footsteps. A bell above the door gave a soft, friendly jingle. Inside, the shop was a small maze of shelves and cabinets, each one crammed with objects that had survived other hands, other homes. The air was warm, a little stove glowed red at the back, and near it an iron kettle sat in contented quiet, giving off the faintest whisper of steam. Candlelight and lamplight mingled together, making the corners gentle rather than shadowy. From behind a tall cabinet emerged, Fagin himself shorter than Alfie expected, bundled in layers, his hair a silver cloud around his head, and his eyes bright with a curious, amused alertness. He moved like a man who had learned to live among fragile things without frightening them. "Well, well," Fagin said, voice warm as toasted bread. "If it isn't my lads, dripping like laundry in a storm. And with company too, oh, I do like company." Dodger swept into a bow. "Evening, sir. We've brought you a delicate problem and 3 respectable souls, which is an unusual combination for me, I admit." Fagin's gaze landed on Oliver at once, and the warmth in his expression deepened. "Oliver, my dear boy," he said, as if Oliver's presence were a lamp being lit. "Out in the wet. Come nearer the stove. Come nearer. You'll melt into a puddle otherwise, and I've no shelf for puddles." Oliver smiled. "Good evening, Mr. Fagin," he said gently. "We've come with something that needs mending." Fagin's eyes twinkled. "Ah," he murmured, rubbing his hands together. "A request after my own heart. Broken things are only stories that need the next page." Alfie stood just inside the door, suddenly aware of how young he was, how damp his coat looked, how small his satchel seemed among the shop's grand clutter. Yet the warmth of the stove, of the lamplight, of Fagin's curious welcome wrapped around him like a shawl. "And who might you be?" Fagin asked, turning those bright eyes to Alfie. His tone held no suspicion, only interest, as if meeting a new object in the shop, one that might contain its own hidden music. "Alfie Crane," Alfie said quietly. "Messenger." "A messenger," Fagin repeated, pleased. A fine trade, carrying words and parcels, little bridges between people. Come along then, Alfie Crane. What have you carried to my doorstep tonight? Mr. Avery stepped forward, removing his cap with careful respect. A music box, Fagin exclaimed, delighted, as though someone had offered him a rare sweet. Oh, I do love a music box. A secret tune in a small wooden body like a heart you can wind. Mr. Avery drew the box from beneath his coat and held it out as if presenting something precious and slightly ashamed. The lid was polished by years of touch. Its corners were worn smooth. It looked as though it had been carried a great deal, carried the way one carries a memory. Fagin accepted it with a craftsman's reverence, turning it in his hands, listening to the faint, silent weight of it. And what's the trouble then? Alfie opened his satchel and produced the spring, now wrapped in a scrap of cloth Oliver had offered to keep it dry. He placed it on Fagin's palm and watched, breath held, as Fagin's face softened into focus. Ah, Fagin said, so quietly it felt like a kindness. There you are. His fingers, quick, careful, lifted the spring and held it to the lamplight. The coil flashed, delicate as a filament. Fagin's eyes narrowed, not with severity, but with attention. This, he murmured, is the voice of the box. Mr. Avery's shoulders sagged with a weary relief at hearing the trouble named properly. It snapped, he said. I felt it go. I looked for it at a tavern by the river, but it was gone, and Alfie found it, Oliver said, looking at Alfie with that steady kindness that made praise feel like warmth rather than embarrassment. He wanted to return it. Fagin lifted his gaze to Alfie. Did you now? He asked gently. Alfie nodded, suddenly shy. I thought someone might miss it. Fagin's smile was small and real. Aye, he said. Someone would. Dodger leaned against a cabinet, as if pretending he had nothing to do with any of it, and said, almost under his breath, He's got a conscience, this one. Nuisance, really. Fagin chuckled. Conscience is only a nuisance to the wicked, he said pleasantly. To the rest of us, it's a lantern. He carried the spring and the box toward the back table near the stove, where a lamp burned low and steady. Tools lay arranged there, not in a frightening jumble, but in a neat, familiar way. Tiny screwdrivers, a magnifying lens, a little tin of oil, a strip of beeswax, and a cloth folded as precisely as a handkerchief. Now, Fagin said, settling himself on a stool, let us see what London has brought to my hands tonight. The boys gathered, but not too close. Oliver stood with his hands clasped, as if holding patience. Dodger perched on a crate like a sparrow, swinging one foot. Alfie stood nearest, because it was his errand, and because his heart would not let him stray. Mr. Avery hovered, half afraid to breathe. Fagin opened the music box with careful fingers. Inside, the small metal teeth and cylinder gleamed dully, waiting. He turned the winding key a fraction, and the mechanism moved without singing an unmistakable silence, like a smile that didn't reach the eyes. He murmured. Yes, the spring has slipped away from its home. Mr. Avery's voice came out in a quiet rush. It played my wife's tune, he said. A little air she liked. Aye. Fagin did not look up, but his hands softened even more. Then we shall coax it back, he said, as if that were the simplest thing in the world. Not for the sake of the object, though I do like objects, but for the sake of what it carries. Dodger made a theatrical sigh. Listen to him, he told Alfie. He talks like everything's got feelings. Fagin glanced up, eyes bright. Everything's got a history, he corrected. And history is only feelings that have settled down. Oliver's mouth curved. That sounds right, he said. Alfie watched Fagin's fingers work. They were deft, but also unhurried, as if the act of mending were a kind of bedtime story itself, slow, careful, reassuring. Fagin examined the spring's end where it had snapped, then peered into the box, murmuring little observations that sounded like affection. A clean break, he said. Not too cruel. We can work with this. Mr. Avery's hands twisted together. Can it be fixed? Fagin lifted his eyebrows. A broken tune is still a tune, he said. Sometimes it merely wants a little persuasion. He reached for the magnifying lens and held it over the mechanism. The lamplight pooled through the glass, turning the tiny parts into a small golden world. The rain outside pattered faintly against the window, and the stove ticked and sighed as it cooled and warmed in slow cycles. For a time, no one spoke much. It was the kind of silence that soothed rather than strained. Alfie felt his breathing slow without being told. He felt the warmth in his fingers, the weight of his coat drying, the gentle closeness of the shop around him. Then Fagin clicked his tongue softly. He said. The spring's end needs a hook. Dodger raised a hand like a schoolboy. I'm already miserable when I'm hungry, he offered. Fagin waved him away. Hunger is a separate tragedy, he said, and I've got biscuits in the tin, if you behave like a human boy for 5 minutes. Dodger's eyes widened as if he'd been offered a title. I can behave, he promised at once, very sincerely. Oliver hid a smile behind his hand. Just 5 minutes? He teased. Dodger looked wounded. Oliver, he said, do you doubt my virtue? Oliver's voice was gentle as a blanket. I doubt your patience, he said. Fagin chuckled again, and the sound made the shop feel even warmer. He set the spring down and stood. I need one small thing, he said, glancing at a shelf. A bit of fine ribbon wire thin enough to help make the hook steady. I have some, but it's buried. Dodger sprang up. I'll find it, he declared, already rooting through a cabinet with exaggerated seriousness, as if searching for treasure. Fagin's gaze slid to Alfie. And you, messenger boy, he said softly, you have sharp eyes. Would you do me a small favour? On that shelf there, see the tin with the little painted violets. Bring it here. Carefully now. It bites, sometimes. Alfie stepped forward and took the tin down with both hands. It was heavier than it looked, and faintly warm, as if it had been sitting near the stove for years. He carried it to the table as if carrying a sleeping kitten. Well done, Fagin murmured, taking it. You've the hands for careful work. Alfie's chest warmed in a different way. Praise was rare in his world. When it came, it usually sounded like surprise. Fagin's sounded like certainty. Fagin opened the tin and revealed coiled lengths of thin wire and tiny fastenings. He selected one with the delicacy of a man choosing a thread for embroidery. The lamplight made the wire glint like a hair of silver. Mr. Avery watched, barely blinking. You do this often, he said quietly. Fagin's mouth quirked. Often enough, he replied. London drops things. London breaks things. London forgets things. Someone has to remember how they fit together. Oliver looked around the shop with fondness. It's like a place where the city's lost pockets empty out, he said. A poetic way to put it, Fagin said, pleased. Yes, a pocket's worth of London, all gathered here. Dodger, still rummaging, declared triumphantly. Found your ribbon wire, sir. It was hiding behind a brass shoehorn like it was ashamed of itself. Fagin took it with a nod. Everything hides when it's afraid of being used, he said. Even boys sometimes. Dodger's grin softened, just for a moment, before he covered it with mischief again. I never hide, he lied cheerfully. Fagin set to work. He used the wire to form a tiny, careful hook, then steadied it with a touch of beeswax, then fixed the spring's end with the gentlest bend so slight Alfie barely saw it happen. All the while, the shop seemed to hold its breath with them, the kettle murmuring, the stove glowing, the rain tapping like a patient finger on the glass. When the hook was made, Fagin held it up for the light. There, he said softly. Not too proud, not too plain, just right. Mr. Avery's eyes shone. Will it hold? It will hold, Fagin said, and then added, as if speaking to the spring itself, if it is treated kindly. He returned the spring to the box, fingers steady. The mechanism accepted it as if recognizing its missing part. He paused, glancing at Mr. Avery. Shall we? Fagin asked, gently. Mr. Avery swallowed. Yes, he whispered. Fagin wound the key another turn, then lifted his hand away. For a heartbeat, there was only the rain and the quiet shop. Then, softly, sweetly, the music began. It was not loud. It was not showy. It was a thin, delicate tune, like a ribbon of sound, unfurling through the warm air. It seemed to brighten the lamplight, to soften the fog beyond the windows. It made Alfie feel, absurdly, as though his ribs were a cage with the door left open. Mr. Avery closed his eyes, and the lines in his face eased, as if the tune were smoothing them from the inside. Oliver's expression went tender and still. Dodger, for once, said nothing at all. He simply listened, his grin gone gentle, his foot stilled, the tune ended, the last note fading like steam from a cup. The shop held the silence afterward like a blanket. Mr. Avery opened his eyes, and there was gratitude there, deep and quiet, like a well. "You've brought it back," he said to Alfie, voice thick with feeling. Alfie shook his head quickly, embarrassed by the weight of it. "I only found the spring," he murmured. Mr. Avery looked at him steadily. "That's how it starts," he said. "Small things. A spring. A boy who does not leave it in the gutter. That's how hope works, I think." Fagin closed the lid carefully. "Hope is a stubborn little mechanism," he said, almost briskly, as though refusing to let the moment become too heavy. "Now then, the tune is back, but we should keep it safe. No more tavern floors for you, Mr. Avery, unless you sit on a chair and refuse to move." Mr. Avery gave a small, shaky laugh. "I'll do my best." Oliver's voice was soft. "Is it the tune you meant to play at the gatehouse?" he asked. Mr. Avery hesitated. His fingers rested on the lid of the box, stroking it once as if soothing it. He said quietly. "I come there on certain nights. Tonight." He paused. "Tonight it would have been her birthday. I thought I'd play it for her, in the quiet, where the lantern glows. It sounds foolish aloud." "It doesn't sound foolish," Oliver said at once. Dodger cleared his throat, suddenly too aware of the tenderness in the room. "Sounds like a proper plan," he said, trying for his usual swagger and failing, which made him oddly sincere. "And if you like, we'll escort you. Not because you need it, mind. Just because, well, a tune's better with witnesses." Fagin's eyes softened. "A tune's better with company," he agreed. Mr. Avery looked from face to face. "You'd all come?" he asked, astonished. Alfie surprised himself by speaking before thinking. "I'd like to," he said quietly, earnestly. "If that's all right." Mr. Avery's gaze warmed. "It would be more than all right," he said. "It would be a kindness I didn't expect." Fagin stood, and with the air of a man concluding a ceremonial matter, poured 4 small cups of tea from the kettle. He handed them around with a little flourish, as if tea were an official seal. "A toast," Fagin said, raising his cup, "to mended springs and boys who notice what the city drops." Oliver lifted his cup. Dodger did too, careful not to slosh it. Alfie held his with both hands, feeling its warmth, feeling the steadiness of the moment. They drank, and the tea tasted faintly of spice and comfort. Outside, the fog pressed its face to the window, curious but not unkind. The gaslights waited. The rain kept tapping, and somewhere inside Alfie, a boy who had wanted only to complete one last errand that left someone safely cared for something settled. Not finished, exactly, but steadied, like a spring placed back where it belonged. Fagin, having concluded his little ceremony of tea as if it were an official stamp upon the evening, set the cups down with quiet satisfaction. The warmth of the shop had begun to coax the damp from coats and caps. Even the air felt softened, as though it had been stirred with a spoon. "Well then," he said, brisk in the way some people became brisk to hide tenderness, "we've restored the voice to the box. Now we must see it used properly, or it'll sulk and go silent out of spite." Mr. Avery smiled, truly smiled now, and cradled the music box in both hands, as if it were a living thing that might startle. "I should like to play it," he said, almost shyly. "At the gatehouse. For the lantern. For old times." "Excellent," Dodger declared. "A public performance. I shall be your manager. I demand 1 biscuit per tune." Oliver's eyes flicked to the biscuit tin with gentle amusement. "You demand biscuits from everyone," he said. "I have a large spirit," Dodger replied solemnly. "It requires sustenance." Fagin lifted a finger. He warned, and then, with a faint smile, went to a shelf and produced a small paper packet tied with string. He pressed it into Dodger's hands. "Biscuits for the road," he said. "And mind these are for sharing, not for swallowing in one heroic gulp." Dodger clutched the packet to his chest as if it were a treasure. "Sharing," he repeated, and looked as if he'd been asked to perform a miracle. Fagin turned to Alfie. "And you," he said softer, "take this." He held out a small scrap of oilcloth, folded neatly. "Wrap your satchel strap with it. Keeps the damp from biting the leather. A messenger boy ought to have a satchel that outlasts the weather." Alfie accepted it with careful hands. "Thank you, sir," he murmured. Fagin's bright eyes took him in cap, tired coat, the earnest set of his mouth. "You did a good thing," he said simply, and then, as if afraid of being too solemn, added, "Don't let it go to your head. You'll start walking like a bishop." Dodger snorted. Oliver's smile warmed. Alfie felt his cheeks heat, and he kept his gaze on his hands, as though the oilcloth were fascinating. When they stepped back out into the street, the fog greeted them like a familiar shawl. The rain had eased further, now more of a gentle, steady whisper. Gaslight made long puddles shine, and the cobbles reflected the lamps in trembling streaks of gold. The warmth of Fagin's shop clung to them for a moment like the memory of a hearth when you step into the cold. Fagin stood in the doorway and watched them go, one hand lifted in a small wave that seemed to say, "Go on then, carry the kindness along." "Mind the puddles," he called softly. Dodger threw a salute. "Always, sir. Puddles fear me." "Puddles fear no one," Fagin replied, amused. "They only wait." They walked together through Holborn's quieter lanes, the city settling deeper into itself. Somewhere, far off, a carriage rolled like distant thunder softened by wool. The fog made each sound arrive gentler than it ought, as though London were practicing hush. Mr. Avery kept the music box under his coat again, though now it felt less like hiding and more like cherishing. Once, he stopped beneath a lamp and touched the lid through the fabric, his fingers tracing the worn edge. "I'd forgotten," he said quietly, not quite addressing anyone, and yet including them all. Oliver walked beside him, attentive in the way he always seemed to be quietly watching for the moment a person needed something, and offering it before pride could protest. "It's a comfort," Oliver said, "and comforts are not foolish." Dodger, perhaps sensing the tenderness rising again, cleared his throat and tried to lift it into play. "If tunes are hands on shoulders," he said, "then biscuits are hands on stomachs, which is equally noble." Alfie heard himself laugh a small sound, but real, and the laugh surprised him. He had not laughed much lately. Laughter had seemed a luxury for boys who did not count pennies and minutes. Yet here it was, drifting up like steam from a kettle. By the time they reached the chapel gatehouse alcove, the lantern was still burning, its glow steady and patient. Mr. Sallow sat in his chair like a small guardian of the night, shawl pulled close, his book open again, as though the pages themselves were warm. "Well," Mr. Sallow said, pleased, "you've returned with a gentleman and a secret. That's a good outing." Mr. Avery stepped into the light. "Good evening," he said, voice gentle. I believe I have myself again, thanks to these boys." "And to your lantern." Mr. Sallow's eyes softened. "It's not my lantern," he said. "It belongs to anyone who needs it." His gaze dropped to the shape under Mr. Avery's coat. "Is the little box singing again?" Mr. Avery nodded, and the motion looked almost like relief. "Yes," he said. "It is." Dodger made a flourishing gesture. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the fog, "prepare yourselves for culture." Oliver gave him a look that was half warning, half fondness. "Dodger," he murmured. "I'm whispering," Dodger protested at once. "Look, my lips are barely moving. I'm the very picture of restraint." Mr. Avery, smiling now, stepped to the gate and turned so that the lantern light fell across his hands. The rain was softer here, the alcove sheltering them. The world beyond was blurred by mist, the street lamps halos in the fog. He brought out the music box. Its lid gleamed faintly, polished by use. The small, winding key caught the light like a discreet piece of jewellery. Mr. Avery's fingers hovered over it, as if asking permission, as if making sure the night was ready. Then he wound it slowly, carefully, and opened the lid. The tune began at once, delicate as breath. It seemed to weave itself into the rain, to braid with the fog, to make the lantern light glow warmer. It was a simple air, but it held tenderness, the way a plain room can hold love if someone has lived kindly there. The little notes fell into the quiet like soft coins dropped into a palm. Mr. Sallow closed his eyes. Oliver's face went still with that steady gentleness that had guided Alfie from the start. Dodger, astonishingly quiet, leaned against the wall and listened as if he'd been caught by something honest. Alfie stood very still. The tune did not belong to him, and yet it felt as if it were doing something for him too, loosening something tight, smoothing a rough edge inside his chest. A passerby paused in the fog, a woman with a shawl over her head, basket on her arm. She did not come close. She only stood a moment, hearing the tune, And then, as if satisfied the night still held sweetness, she went on. The music box played to the end, and the last note faded into the lantern's steady hum. Mr. Avery shut the lid gently. His breath came out slowly. "Thank you," he said, voice low. "You can play it here whenever you like," Mr. Sallow told him. "The lantern doesn't mind being serenaded." Dodger's whisper was almost reverent. "Even the lantern gets dates," he said. Oliver gave a small smile. "It's good," he said softly, "to let something gentle be heard." Mr. Avery looked down at the box again, and his expression shifted not into sadness, exactly, but into something thoughtful, as if the tune had opened a door in him, and he could see another room beyond. "I should tell you," he said, and his gaze settled on Alfie first, perhaps because Alfie had been the beginning of it. "This box, it isn't truly mine." Alfie blinked. "It isn't?" Mr. Avery shook his head. "It belonged to my wife. Yes, she kept it close, but she had it on loan, you might say." He hesitated, choosing his words as carefully as Fagin had shaped the hook. "There is a woman, Mrs. Penfold, who keeps the narrow bookshop just there, with the sheltered step." He nodded toward the street where Alfie had found the spring. "She lends comfort in many forms. Books, a warm word, a bit of candlelight when a person needs it. She lent my wife this music box for an evening long ago, and somehow it stayed with us. Not out of dishonesty, out of life being busy. And then," he paused, "then my wife fell ill, and I could not bring myself to return it. The tune was all I had that still sounded like her." Oliver's eyes softened further, if that were possible. "And now?" he asked gently. "And now," Mr. Avery said, "I meant to return it tonight. It is her birthday. I thought if I could return the box, repaired, still singing, it would feel like closing a circle kindly, like saying thank you, properly, after far too long." Alfie felt something settle into place, as neat as a parcel string pulled tight. The spring had not only belonged to a tune, it belonged to an act of returning. His longing to deliver one last errand that leaves someone safely cared for glowed quietly inside him. "I can take it," Alfie said before he quite realized he was speaking. Then, more carefully, "I mean, if you'd like, I'm a messenger." Mr. Avery looked at him, and the gratitude in his eyes was deep enough to feel like warmth. "Would you?" he asked softly. "It would be right, somehow. You found the missing heart of it. You should be the one to carry it home." Dodger immediately puffed himself up. "We'll escort," he declared. "A delivery of cultural importance. High society. Very respectable." Mr. Sallow chuckled. "Mind you don't trip over your respectability," he advised. Oliver's voice was steady and kind. "We can go together," he said to Alfie. "It's only a little way, and it's good to finish what you began." Mr. Avery held the box out to Alfie as if it were a trust, not merely an object. Alfie accepted it with both hands. It was warm from being held close. It had weight, not heavy, but meaningful. For a moment, Alfie imagined the bookshop doorway again, the sheltered step, the spines in the window, the candlelight. He imagined Mrs. Penfold, whoever she was, opening her hands to receive the box, hearing the tune again, feeling a quiet circle complete. "I'll do it carefully," Alfie promised, voice low. Mr. Avery nodded. "I know you will." They left Mr. Sallow at his gatehouse with a portion of Dodger's biscuits and Oliver's remaining loaf besides Mr. Sallow protesting, of course, and then accepting, of course, because that was the gentle way of such exchanges. The rain whispered. The lantern burned on, steady as ever. Alfie walked with the music box tucked in his satchel, but this time he held the satchel with both hands, as if the tune inside might shift if jostled. Oliver stayed close at his side, a quiet anchor. Dodger took point again, directing them around puddles with absurd solemnity. "Here," Dodger whispered, pointing at a particularly treacherous patch of cobble. "That one's got a wicked glint, best avoided." "You speak of puddles as if they've got personalities," Alfie murmured. "They do," Dodger insisted. "That one there's named Herbert. Don't trust Herbert." Oliver's laugh was soft, and Alfie felt his shoulders ease. When they reached the narrow bookshop doorway, the sheltered step looked much as it had earlier wet stone, a slight recess, a sense of quiet invitation. The window still glowed faintly, suggesting someone inside had not yet surrendered the night. A bell chimed softly as Dodger pushed the door. Warmth met them at once, different from Fagin's shop. more like a cozy sitting room disguised as a place of business. The air smelled of paper and leather bindings, with a faint sweetness of tea. A small fire burned in a grate at the back, its embers making a gentle, living light. Shelves rose like walls of stories, their spines worn and friendly, and a rug lay by the hearth as if expecting tired feet. Behind a counter stood a woman in a shawl, spectacles perched low on her nose. Her hair was pinned neatly, though a few wisps had escaped, giving her a slightly wind-blown air even indoors. She looked up as the bell rang, and her eyes sharpened with practical curiosity. "Jack Dawkins," she said, and her tone suggested she had known him long enough to be neither alarmed nor easily impressed. "If you've brought rain into my shop, you'll be wiping your boots." Dodger bowed extravagantly. "Mrs. Penfold," he said, "I would never. I'm a gentleman of the highest." "A gentleman of the highest puddles," she cut in, and then her gaze moved to Oliver and softened. "Oliver, love," she said, and the warmth in the words felt like a hearth. "Out in that weather." Oliver smiled, polite and gentle. "Good evening, Mrs. Penfold." Her eyes shifted again to Alfie, standing quietly with his satchel held as if it were precious. Alfie suddenly felt shy, as though the books themselves were watching him. "And who is this?" Mrs. Penfold asked, not unkindly. Alfie cleared his throat. "Alfie Crane," he said. "Messenger." "Ah," she said, as if that explained the careful way he stood. "A working boy." "Come in then, Alfie Crane. Warm yourself a moment." Dodger, never able to resist drama, whispered loudly, "He's on a noble delivery." Mrs. Penfold arched an eyebrow. "With you involved, Jack, noble usually means complicated." Oliver stepped forward, voice soft. "We've come to return something," he said gently. "Something that belongs to you." Mrs. Penfold's eyes narrowed, not suspicious but focused. "Return," she repeated, and the word sounded like a page turning. Alfie opened his satchel carefully and drew out the music box. The lamplight from the grate caught the wood's worn polish. The little key gleamed faintly. Mrs. Penfold's face changed at once, surprise first, then recognition, and then something like emotion quickly reined in, as though she were not a woman who indulged in displays. "My word," she murmured. "That." Mr. Avery stepped in behind them, cap in hand. "Mrs. Penfold," he said softly. "Good evening." She blinked, and her sternness softened into something gentler, lined with memory. "Mr. Avery," she said, "you look thinner." He smiled faintly. "Time insists," he said. Mrs. Penfold's gaze dropped to the music box again. "I thought it gone for good," she said quietly. "I should have returned it years ago," Mr. Avery admitted. "It was lent in kindness, and I kept it in grief. Tonight," he swallowed, "tonight I wanted to bring it back properly, but the springs snapped, and I feared I'd ruined it." Mrs. Penfold's fingers hovered over the lid without touching it yet, as if afraid it might vanish. "And yet," she said slowly, "it sits here in my shop again." Alfie found his voice. "I found the spring," he said, earnest and quiet. "By your step. We took it to Mr. Fagin. He repaired it. It plays again." Mrs. Penfold looked at Alfie then, really looked, taking in the wet cap, the tired coat, the careful hands. Her expression softened in a way that made Alfie feel, for a moment, as if he were standing closer to the fire than he actually was. "So you did?" she said. "You noticed what others might have stepped over," Dodger put in, unable to help himself. "He's got eyes like a hawk and a conscience like trouble," Mrs. Penfold finished, though her mouth twitched, almost smiling. Mr. Avery nodded toward Alfie. "He carried it here," he said, "like it mattered." "It does matter," Mrs. Penfold said simply. She took the music box from Alfie's hands and held it close for a moment, as if feeling the shape of an old evening. Then, with a slow care, she wound the key and opened the lid. The tune drifted out again, softer here, wrapped in the scent of books and the warmth of the hearth. The firelight trembled. Outside, the rain whispered. Inside, the little notes made a pocket of gentleness. A private room in the middle of London. Mrs. Penfold's eyes shone behind her spectacles, and she blinked once, briskly, as though dealing with dust. "That," she said, and her voice was steadier than her expression, "is exactly as I remember." Mr. Avery's shoulders eased. "I'm glad," he whispered. Oliver stood with his hands clasped, face calm and kind. Dodger listened with unusual stillness, the bravado quieted by something honest. Alfie felt the warmth of the hearth seep through him, as if the tune were a second fire. When the music ended, Mrs. Penfold shut the lid gently and held the box as though it might still be speaking. "Thank you," she said, and her gaze moved from Mr. Avery to Alfie, lingering on the boy. "You've returned more than wood and metal tonight. You've returned a small comfort to its rightful home." Alfie swallowed. The words made his chest ache in a good way. Mrs. Penfold set the music box on the counter, safe among books and candlelight, and then, without making a fuss, reached beneath the counter and produced a mug and a small tin. "Now," she said briskly, as if kindness required practicality, "you boys look half frozen. There's tea on the back hob, and if Jack Dawkins touches my biscuit tin without asking, I'll have him shelving books until spring." Dodger's eyes widened. "Shelving books?" he whispered to Alfie. "That's labour." Mrs. Penfold pointed at him. "Ask," she said. Dodger inhaled, like a man preparing for a heroic act. "May I," he said very solemnly, "have one biscuit?" Mrs. Penfold slid the tin toward him. "One," she allowed. Dodger took one as reverently as if it were a communion wafer, then broke it in half and, astonishing everyone, perhaps even himself, held half out to Alfie. Alfie blinked. "Me?" Dodger shrugged, suddenly looking a bit awkward. "Well," he muttered, "you did the noble bit. Might as well have the noble biscuit." Oliver's smile warmed. "That's very kind, Dodger," he said softly. Dodger scowled at the fire. "Don't ruin it," he murmured. "I've got a reputation." Alfie accepted the biscuit half and took a small bite. It tasted sweet and comforting, like a reward that didn't feel like charity, just a simple sharing in a warm room. Mrs. Penfold poured tea, and the steam rose in the lamplight like gentle fog. Alfie held the mug, letting its warmth seep into his fingers, and felt, quietly, that his last errand had become something more than a delivery. It had become a small circle of care, closed softly, in the heart of Victorian London. The tea in Mrs. Penfold's mug was the colour of late amber, and it smelled faintly of bergamot and warmth. Alfie sat on the edge of a low chair near the hearth, careful not to sink too deeply into comfort, as if comfort might charge him rent. The fire made a soft, companionable crackle, and the rows of books seemed to lean in, listening quiet spines with patient titles, as though every shelf were a street in a gentler city. Mrs. Penfold moved about with the brisk grace of someone who had learned to be kind without making a ceremony of it. She straightened a stack of pamphlets, nudged a coal in the grate, and set the music box in a small glass-fronted cabinet, as neatly as one might place a bird back into its cage. Only this cage was meant for safekeeping, not for keeping in. "There," she said, satisfied. "Where it belongs." Mr. Avery stood a moment longer by the counter, hands clasped. He looked at the cabinet as if he could still hear the tune hovering inside. The lines in his face were softer now, not erased, but eased as if someone had loosened a tight collar. "I don't know how to repay any of you," he said quietly. Dodger lifted his biscuit half like a badge. "You can repay me by remembering I'm a gentleman," he said, "and by telling the world Jack Dawkins is a patron of the arts." Mrs. Penfold made a sound that was half snort, half laugh. "The world will believe what it likes," she said, "and the world has known you longer than you think." Oliver, who had been warming his hands by the fire, turned and gave Mr. Avery that steady, careful kindness that felt like a lamp held low on a dark path. "You've done something good tonight," Oliver said. "You've brought it back. That matters." Mr. Avery's gaze went thoughtful. "Aye," he said. "It does. And it feels lighter." He swallowed. "I expect grief doesn't leave all at once, does it?" "No," Oliver said softly. "But it can learn to sit down." That simple sentence seemed to settle on the room like a blanket. Alfie felt his chest tighten in a tender way, and he stared into his tea as if the steam could hide his thoughts. Mrs. Penfold, perhaps sensing the weight of the moment, cleared her throat and turned brisk again. "Now," she said, "if you are all determined to collect kindness like pennies tonight, you may as well do it properly." She reached beneath the counter and produced a small square of paper and a stub of pencil. "Jack, stop rustling. Oliver, yes, you may hold the candle nearer." Oliver stepped closer and tilted a small lamp so the light fell across the paper. Mrs. Penfold began to write with quick, neat strokes. "What's that?" Dodger asked at once, suspicious of anything involving paper. "A note," Mrs. Penfold said without looking up. "Because some people sleep better when they've said what they mean." Mr. Avery blinked. A note for me? Mrs. Penfold nodded once, still writing. At the mention of Fagin, Alfie glanced up. Yes, Mrs. Penfold said. He mended what I thought was lost. I may be brisk, Alfie Crane, but I'm not ungrateful, and I like people to know when they've done well, especially those who spend their days mending the world quietly, when no one claps. Dodger looked faintly offended on Fagin's behalf. I clap, he said. I clap all the time. You clap for yourself, Mrs. Penfold corrected. Dodger's grin returned. Someone must. Mrs. Penfold finished writing, folded the first note, and slid it across to Mr. Avery. There, she said. A few words, so you don't feel you've taken without permission. Consider the music box lent, truly lent, for as long as you wish to wind it by the lantern. But do come in from time to time and tell me whether the tune still behaves itself. Mr. Avery stared down at the note as if it were a small miracle. His voice came out rough. Thank you, he managed. Mrs. Penfold's expression softened. It's only proper, she said, and then, brisk again, folded the second note. She held it out not to Oliver, not to Dodger, but to Alfie. You, she said. Alfie sat up straighter. Me? You're a messenger, she replied, as if that settled it. And tonight, you've made yourself useful in the very best way. Take this to Mr. Fagin, hand it to him yourself, and if he offers you biscuits, you may accept without making that guilty face. Alfie's ears warmed. I don't, he began. Mrs. Penfold gave him a look. You do, she said. Oliver's smile flickered, quietly amused, quietly fond. Dodger leaned in, whispering to Alfie as if sharing a state secret. She sees everything, he murmured. Even thoughts. Alfie took the note carefully, as though it might tear under his fingers, and slipped it into his satchel in a dry inner pocket. The satchel suddenly felt different to him tonight, not merely a tool for work, but a little vessel for gentle errands. And what about the tavern woman? Oliver asked softly, thoughtful as ever. Mrs. Penfold paused, pencil still in hand, and nodded once. You've got a good memory, Oliver, she said. Yes, her as well. She wrote a few more lines on a third scrap, folded it, and tucked it into a small envelope. Then she handed it to Oliver. For you, she said, because you'll actually give it to her without turning it into a performance. Dodger clapped a hand to his chest in mock agony. No confidence, he sighed. Mrs. Penfold's gaze slid to him. Oh, I have confidence, she said. I'm confident you'd make it sound like a proclamation from the Queen. Dodger brightened. Exactly. Oliver tucked the envelope safely inside his coat. Thank you, he said. His voice was quiet, but the gratitude was plain. Mrs. Penfold poured a final bit of tea into Alfie's mug, topping it up as if refilling a lamp. Now drink, she commanded gently, and warm your hands. You look like a boy who forgets he's allowed to be comfortable. Alfie stared at the fire a moment. I'm allowed? He asked before he could stop himself. The room seemed to hush, not uncomfortably, simply attentively. Mrs. Penfold's briskness softened into something steadier. Allowed, she said. Not always, perhaps, but you can take it when it appears. Comfort is like a seat on a crowded omnibus. If you never sit, you'll think it doesn't exist. Dodger whispered. She's a philosopher, this one. Oliver's voice was gentle. You've done something good tonight, Alfie, he added, as if he wanted the thought to land firmly. It's all right to let that good thing warm you. Alfie nodded and took a slow sip of tea. It was hot, sweetened just enough, and it made his chest feel less tight. For a moment he could almost imagine what it might be like to come in from rain and not immediately begin worrying about what came next. Outside the window, fog pressed close, turning the street into a softened painting. A gas lamp glowed with a pale halo, and the rain made faint streaks down the glass like slow handwriting. After a little while after the tea had done its quiet work and the fire had eased the damp from their coats, the night began to tug them onward again. Not with urgency, but with that gentle sense that every warm room is a pause rather than a place to stay forever. Mr. Avery placed Mrs. Penfold's note in his pocket with great care. He stood by the counter, fingers resting lightly on the glass-fronted cabinet where the music box now sat. I'll come back, he promised her quietly. I'll tell you how it sounds by the lantern. Mrs. Penfold nodded, satisfied, and then, because she could not help herself, added, And do eat properly, Mr. Avery. The world is not improved by thin men pretending they don't need supper. Mr. Avery's smile deepened. Yes, ma'am, he said with the air of a man who had once been scolded by kinder people and had survived. Dodger, who could never leave a room without making it theatrical, offered Mrs. Penfold another bow. We thank you for the tea, the fire, and the mild threats, he said. They were all most restorative. Mrs. Penfold waved him away. Go on with you, she said. And Jack Dawkins, wipe your boots properly next time. Dodger glanced down at his boots as if meeting them for the first time. Oliver lingered at the doorway. Good night, Mrs. Penfold, he said softly. Mrs. Penfold's expression softened again. Good night, love, she said. Mind the rain. Then they were out again, 3 boys and 1 weary clerk stepping back into Victorian London's fog and gaslight, where the rain made the cobbles shine and the night smelled of wet stone and chimney smoke. They walked slowly. There was no rush now. The music box had been returned. The spring was no longer lost. The tune had been heard by lantern light. Yet the night still held a few small threads of kindness to tie off properly, notes to deliver, thanks to pass along, warmth to share as it travelled from hand to hand. Oliver led them first, as if following an inner map made of quiet obligations. The tavern isn't far, he said. We can give her Mrs. Penfold's note. Dodger puffed out a breath. I do like giving notes, he said. Makes me feel official, like I ought to have a seal. You'd seal it with crumbs, Oliver murmured. Crumbs are honest, Dodger replied. Alfie walked between them, the note to Fagin snug in his satchel, his hands tucked under his arms for warmth. He felt different than he had earlier, still tired, still a working boy but less alone in the tiredness. The city felt, for tonight, like it had openings. Doorways with sheltered steps, gatehouse alcoves with lanterns, tavern corners with kettles, shops with hearths and kind eyes. When they reached the Riverside tavern again, the windows were still steamed and glowing. The side nook was quieter now, the kettle still murmuring, as if it had never stopped. The woman in the apron looked up as they entered and shook her head in amused disbelief. You again, she said. What is it tonight, Lost Crown Jewels? Dodger spread his hands. Better, he said. A tune. Oliver offered the envelope. This is for you, he said gently. From Mrs. Penfold. She wanted to thank you for helping. The woman took the envelope, surprised. Mrs. Penfold? She repeated. From the bookshop? Oliver nodded. The woman's face softened. She tucked the envelope into her apron pocket without opening it, as if she already knew what it would say. Well, she said quietly, that's kind. And you lot, did you find who it belonged to then? We did, Oliver said, glancing at Alfie and Dodger with quiet pride. Dodger could not resist. We solved the case, he declared, by bravery, brilliance, and the strategic use of tea. The woman laughed, and the sound was a warm, human thing that seemed to brighten the nook. Go on then, she said. Warm your hands a moment. You're dripping again, Jack Dawkins. It's my signature look, Dodger replied. Alfie stood near the stove, letting the warmth touch him once more. The woman looked at him, really looked, and her voice gentled. You're the messenger boy, she said. The one who was set on finding that spring? Alfie nodded, suddenly shy. Well, she said, you did a good thing. Don't let the world tell you it's nothing. Good things are rare enough. Alfie's throat tightened. He managed. Oliver thanked her again, and after a few more gentle words, nothing loud, nothing long, they stepped back out into the fog. The river air cooled their cheeks, but it didn't bite the way it had earlier. The warmth they'd gathered seemed to sit under their coats like a hidden ember. Next stop, Dodger said, pointing dramatically as if the fog were a stage, back to Fagin. We deliver Mrs. Penfold's note, and we accept biscuits with dignity. Alfie patted his satchel instinctively, checking the note's safe corner. Will he be awake? He asked. Dodger grinned. Fagin is always awake, he said. If he ever sleeps. The objects start rearranging themselves out of boredom. Oliver's tone was fond. He'll be glad to know the box is home, he said. And I think he'll be glad to see you again, Alfie. Alfie wasn't sure why that thought warmed him so much, but it did. Perhaps because it meant he wasn't simply a boy passing through people's lives like a parcel passed from hand to hand. Perhaps because, tonight, he had left a little mark, small, gentle, real. They turned back toward Holborn, the gas lamps glowing like patient stars in the fog, and the rain whispering softer and softer, as though even it were beginning to grow sleepy. The walk back to Fagin's shop felt different from the walk toward it, as if the city itself had shifted its weight. The fog was still there. Certainly London never quite let go of its fog when November had settled in, but it seemed less pressing now, less like a curtain, and more like a quilt. The gas lamps still wore their halos, the cobbles still shone with rain, yet everything carried a faint sense of having been put a little more in order, like a room after someone has tidied without telling you. Alfie walked with the note snug in his satchel, and every so often his fingers brushed the pocket where it lay. He could not have said why a folded scrap of paper felt important, and yet it did important in the way a ribbon is important to a parcel, or a button to a coat. Small things, properly placed, made the world behave. Dodger kept ahead as usual, a lively shadow in the lamplight, his hat brim tilted as if challenging the rain to argue with him. Oliver stayed near Alfie, unhurried, his presence like a steady hand at the small of one's back not pushing. Simply there. They passed the chapel lane again, and Alfie glanced toward the gatehouse. The lantern still burned, though they were too far to see Mr. Sallow's face properly. Still, the light itself felt like acknowledgement, as if the city were nodding at them from that quiet corner. "Do you think he's still there?" Alfie murmured, more to Oliver than to Dodger. Oliver followed his gaze. "Mr. Sallow?" he asked softly. "He often is. He likes the quiet, I think." Dodger, who had overheard, called back without slowing. "He's married to that lantern," he said. "If he ever leaves, it'll be because the lantern asked him politely." Oliver's smile was faint. "It's good to know someone stays," he said, and the words held more than their surface meaning. Alfie understood. In a city where so much moved and vanished coin, bread, people, there was comfort in the thought of a familiar light kept burning. When they reached Fagin's shop, the window still glowed like a pocket of warmth stitched into the fog. Objects crowded behind the glass, as if pressed up to see the street. The bell above the door gave its soft jingle again, and the warm tea and wood smell met them like an open palm. Fagin appeared almost at once, as though he had been waiting behind the cabinet with an ear tilted to the bell's voice. "Back again!" he exclaimed, delighted, and then his eyes flicked to their faces with the quick, clever warmth of a man who missed nothing, and dry enough to be respectable. "Oh, London must be ending." Dodger swept into a bow. "We have returned triumphant," he announced. "We have delivered thanks, received praise, and avoided at least 7 puddles with personalities." Fagin lifted an eyebrow. "Only 7? The streets must be in a mild mood." Oliver stepped forward, calm and gentle as ever. "We came to give you this," he said, nodding to Alfie. Alfie stepped in, suddenly aware again of his damp cap, his careful hands, his youth. He reached into his satchel and took out Mrs. Penfold's folded note, holding it out like a formal delivery. "This is from Mrs. Penfold," Alfie said quietly. "She wanted you to have it, for mending the music box." Fagin's bright eyes softened, and he accepted the note with both hands, as if it were a gift, rather than mere paper. "From Mrs. Penfold," he repeated, pleased. "Well, well, that woman could freeze a kettle with a look, but she's got a good heart under all that briskness." Dodger nodded vigorously. "She threatened me with shelving books," he said mournfully. "I nearly fainted." Fagin's mouth quirked. "Shelving books is good for the soul," he said. "Puts ideas above your head where they can drip into you." Dodger looked alarmed. "Ideas drip?" he whispered, stepping subtly away from the shelves. Oliver smiled. "She was grateful," he said simply. "The box is home." Fagin held very still for a moment, the note unopened in his hands, as if he were hearing the tune in his head. Then he let out a satisfied little breath. "Ah," he murmured, "that's as it ought to be. A tune belongs where it's needed." He unfolded the note with care, smoothing the paper on the table near the stove. His lips moved as he read, and the lines around his eyes deepened with a quiet pleasure. "Well," he said, folding it again neatly, "I'll be. Mrs. Penfold's written me words that almost sound like affection. I shall preserve this note under glass and charge admission." Dodger leaned in. "Does she praise you?" he asked avidly, as if praise were a rare sweet. Fagin glanced at him. "She thanks me," he replied, "which, coming from her, is praise enough to make a man sit down." Oliver's gaze slid to Alfie. "You see?" he said softly, as if the lesson were meant for Alfie to keep. "Kindness travels. It comes back. Alfie nodded, and felt something in his chest ease again, like a tight knot loosening of its own accord. Fagin, perhaps noticing that the boys were still damp at the edges, clapped his hands once gently, like a cook deciding things must be done. "Right," he said. "Tea again, and something to eat. I will not have my lads turning into thin ghosts roaming Holborn, frightening respectable puddles." Dodger perked up. "He's talking about feeding," he whispered to Alfie, reverent. Fagin poured tea and produced a small plate of bread with a smear of jam, nothing grand, but warm and honest. Alfie ate slowly, feeling the food settle in him like a quiet promise. He had not realized how hollow he'd been until the warmth filled him. As they ate, the shop's hush wrapped around them, the soft tick of a clock somewhere in the clutter, the kettle's faint whisper, the rain tapping at the window like a polite knuckle. Outside, London continued its nocturnal breathing hooves, wheels, distant voices, but here, among the lamplight and old things, the world seemed reduced to manageable size. Fagin watched Alfie over his cup in a way that was not intrusive, simply attentive, as if turning a thought over. "You're a messenger boy," he said at last. Alfie swallowed and nodded. "Yes, sir." Fagin's gaze drifted to the satchel strap, to the way Alfie held the bag as if it were part of him. "You carry things for other people," he said. "Messages, parcels, little urgencies, little comforts." Alfie felt his ears warm, because it sounded suddenly as if his whole life had been noticed and named. "Yes," he murmured again. Fagin tapped a finger on the table. "And tonight," he continued, "you carried a small kindness from one hand to another until it found its home. That's a different sort of messenger work, not the sort anyone pays you for, mind. But," he paused, and his eyes brightened, "but it pays in other ways." Dodger, between mouthfuls, said, "He means it makes you feel warm inside, like tea, but without the cup." Oliver's smile softened. "That's exactly what it feels like," he agreed. Alfie stared at his tea, embarrassed by how true that was. He thought of the moment he'd bent by the bookshop step and lifted the coil of metal, bright in the lamplight. It had seemed like nothing, just a bit of spring, wet and lost. Yet it had led him through the city's warm pockets, from sheltered doorway to gatehouse lantern to tavern kettle to curiosity shop hearth. It had stitched people together like thread. Fagin's voice gentled. "You've got a careful nature," he said, "and a steady one. Those are good things to have in London." Alfie did not know what to say to that, so he said the simplest thing. "Thank you, sir." Fagin waved it away, but not unkindly. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just keep your eyes open. London drops its good bits as often as its bad ones. The trick is noticing which is which." Dodger chewed thoughtfully, then said, "London drops sausages sometimes. That's always good." Oliver laughed softly. "Only if they're fresh," he said. Dodger looked offended. "Oliver," he protested, "why must you ruin poetry with logic?" Fagin chuckled, and the sound warmed the room again. For a while they sat in easy quiet, drinking tea. The rain continued to soften the streets. The fog leaned against the windows like a sleepy cat. Alfie felt his tiredness settling into a more comfortable shape, less sharp, less lonely. Eventually, as all warm pauses do, the moment began to edge toward ending. Not suddenly, not rudely, just with the gentle sense that the night was readying itself for sleep, and that boys with coats and caps could not remain forever in lamplit shops, however kind the kettle might be. Oliver stood first, smoothing his coat. "We should go," he said softly, and there was no urgency in it, only the calm acknowledgement of time's slow turning. Dodger sighed theatrically. "Time," he muttered, always turning up uninvited. Fagin rose too, and his eyes lingered on Alfie. Alfie hesitated. "A lodging," he said. "Not far." Fagin nodded, as if filing the information away without making a fuss of it. "Good," he said. "Take care on the way. Fog makes fools of men, and puddles make fools of boys." Dodger saluted again. "We will escort him," he declared. Fagin's gaze slid to Dodger, amused. "Escort him," he said, "and do it properly. No racing, no leaping, no pretending you're a carriage." Dodger put a hand to his heart. "I am wounded," he said. "You think me reckless." "I know you," Fagin replied fondly. Oliver stepped close to Alfie, voice gentle. "We can walk with you," he said. "At least part of the way." Alfie felt something swell in his chest, gratitude. Yes, but also a shy, startled feeling of being worth walking with. "All right," he said quietly. They stepped out into the fog again, and the doorbell's soft jingle faded behind them. The street was calmer now, the hour deepening. Gas lamps glowed like warm coins in the mist. Rain fell in such fine threads it seemed less like weather and more like the night's own hush, drifting down. As they walked, Dodger resumed his practical commentary on puddles, but his voice was softer now. Oliver spoke only occasionally, and when he did, it was in a low tone, as if he were trying not to wake the city. Alfie listened to their footsteps, 3 sets of them, steady and close, and he felt the night stretching ahead like a long, quiet corridor with lamps placed kindly along it. They went on at the same unhurried pace, as if their feet had agreed between themselves and the rain that tonight was not for rushing. Holborn's streets narrowed and widened in gentle turns, and the fog moved with them like a quiet companion who did not insist on conversation. Every so often a carriage rolled past in the distance, its wheels hissing on wet stone, and the sound would thin and disappear into the mist as neatly as a ribbon slipping into a pocket. Alfie found that he could tell where they were by the quality of the lamplight. Some lamps burned brighter, some dimmer, some with a faint flicker that made the street look like an old painting coming softly alive. The rain made little beads on the iron posts, and those beads caught the glow and held it, tiny and patient, like stars that had decided to settle nearer the ground. "Not far now," Dodger said, voice lower than earlier, as though he could feel the city growing sleepier. He pointed with a gloved finger, not grandly this time, but plainly. "You turn there, by that brick wall, and then you go straight till you see the door with the cracked blue paint." Alfie nodded. "I know it," he murmured. And he did, yet it mattered. Oddly, to have someone point it out as if it were a destination worth reaching safely. Oliver walked in step beside him. The damp had darkened Oliver's coat at the shoulders, but he did not seem to mind. He carried himself as if warmth was something you could keep inside you, like a candle protected by cupped hands. "You did what you hoped to do," Oliver said softly. Not suddenly, but as if he had been letting the thought ripen. "You delivered something that left someone cared for." Alfie's throat tightened in that familiar way that came when something true was spoken aloud. He stared ahead at the fog, at the lamps, at the wet cobbles, and nodded once. "I didn't know it would turn into all that," Alfie said quietly. Oliver's smile was gentle. "Most good things do," he replied. "They start small." Dodger, half a step ahead, turned and walked backward for 2 paces, peering at Alfie with mock seriousness. "I told you," he said. "Pull one thread, and London unravels into kindness. Quite inconvenient for the city's reputation." Alfie gave a small breath of laughter. "London's still London," he said. Dodger grinned. "Aye," he agreed, and his grin softened. "But tonight it's London with a kettle, which is the best sort." They passed a bakery shuttered for the night, its windows dark, yet the air around it still held the faint ghost of warmth, yeast and flour, and yesterday's sweetness. Alfie breathed it in without meaning to, and for a moment he remembered mornings when he had stood outside such places, hoping for a crust given in kindness, or a penny's worth of something warm. The memory was not sharp tonight. It was simply a thing that had happened, softened by the tune that had been found and returned. Further on, a narrow alley opened, and a lamplighter's pole leaned against a wall like a resting staff. Someone had been here not long ago, setting little suns in glass. Alfie imagined the lamplighter moving through the fog with quiet purpose, touching flame to wick, and then stepping back to see each lamp bloom. It was a pleasing thought, one more person in London, going about a small task that kept the night kind. At last, Dodger slowed at a corner and lifted a hand. "This is where we part," he announced, as if they were travellers at a railway platform. "Alfie Crane, you have been escorted by the finest feet in Holborn." Oliver's voice was soft. "Good night, Alfie," he said. "Sleep warm." Alfie stopped beneath a lamp that made their faces gentle. The fog blurred the edges of the street, but in the lamp's pool the 3 of them were clear. Oliver's steady eyes, Dodger's bright grin, and Alfie's own damp cap and tired coat, which somehow did not feel quite as lonely as they had earlier. "Good night," Alfie said. And then, because he could not quite stop it, he added, "Thank you." Dodger waved a hand as if brushing away sentiment. "Don't mention it," he said quickly. Then, with the air of a boy who did not know what to do with tenderness, and therefore disguised it as humour, he added, "Besides, you owe me. I saved you from Herbert the Puddle." Alfie's smile came more easily now. "I'll remember," he promised. Oliver stepped closer, and very gently adjusted the edge of Alfie's collar, pulling it up a fraction against the damp. The gesture was so simple, so quietly caring, that Alfie felt his eyes sting and had to blink hard. "There," Oliver said softly. "Better." Dodger cleared his throat loudly as if the air had become too sincere. "Right," he declared. "We'll be off then. Come on, Oliver. If we linger, we'll start being wholesome." Oliver's smile deepened, and he let Dodger tug him lightly away. "Good night," Oliver called once more, and then the two of them melted into the fog, their footsteps fading until the rain was the only sound that seemed to remain. Alfie stood a moment longer in the lamp's glow, listening to the city's hush. The night felt larger without them, but not colder, not like before. He turned, as Dodger had indicated, and went straight on until he saw the door with the cracked blue paint. The building was narrow and tired, with brickwork that had seen too many winters. A dim light burned in the passage, and the stairwell smelled of damp wool and old cooking. Alfie slipped inside quietly, pulling the door to behind him with care so it would not bang. The sound of the rain outside became muffled at once, as if someone had closed a music box lid over the world. He climbed the stairs softly, one hand on the banister. His boots made only the faintest creak. Somewhere below, a kettle muttered on a hob, and a voice tired but not angry hushed another voice, as if reminding someone that night was for quiet. Alfie reached his small room at the top, where the ceiling sloped slightly, and the window was a narrow rectangle of darkness. He lit his candle and watched the flame take shape, small and brave in the stale air. The room was not pretty, but it was his place for the night. A narrow bed, a chair, a little shelf for his few things, and a blanket that was thin but clean. He sat on the edge of the bed and unfastened his satchel slowly, as if ending the evening by untying its knots properly. He took out the oilcloth strip Fagin had given him and wrapped it around the worn portion of the strap, smoothing it in place. The leather looked a little better at once, more protected, less frayed. Alfie ran his thumb over it, oddly satisfied. It was the sort of practical care that felt like a hand laid quietly on your work. Then he drew out Mrs. Penfold's note that had been delivered, though it was no longer needed, and smiled faintly at the emptiness of that pocket now. Errands completed. Messages carried. The satchel, usually a burden, felt almost like a companion. He undressed carefully, folding his coat and cap as neatly as he could. He laid them over the chair, where they could dry. He tugged his socks off and rubbed his feet with his hands for warmth, then slipped under the blanket. It was thin, but it had weight enough to tell his body, gently, that it could stop bracing. The rain tapped faintly on the window. In the distance, very far off, a cartwheel squeaked once and then fell silent. The city was settling into sleep the way a tired person settles into a chair slowly, with relief. Alfie lay on his back and stared at the candle flame. It moved slightly when he breathed, leaning this way and that, as if listening. His thoughts wandered back through the night, not in a sharp way, not like worry, but like a lantern swinging gently as you walk. He saw again the narrow bookshop doorway, the sheltered step, the silver coil gleaming in the lamplight. He saw Dodger appearing out of fog like a joke made solid. He saw the chapel gatehouse lantern, steady and patient. He heard the kettle in the riverside nook, and the woman's kindly voice. He smelled Fagin's shop, old wood, tea, a hint of sweetness, and felt again the warmth of the stove near his hands. And then the tune soft, delicate, brave, spilling into the fog, as if the city itself had been wound up for a moment of gentleness. He wondered what Mrs. Penfold was doing now. Perhaps she had locked the bookshop, banked her hearth, and gone upstairs to bed with a book on her lap. Perhaps Mr. Avery was on his way home too, with his note in his pocket and the knowledge quiet as a secret that the tune could be played again by the lantern whenever he wished. Perhaps Mr. Sallow still sat by his gatehouse, shawl around his shoulders, the lantern glowing in its glass, as if the night were being watched over. Perhaps Oliver and Dodger were walking somewhere through the fog, their footsteps light, their faces warmed by the evening's small success. Alfie liked imagining them safe, because it made the city seem safer too. He turned onto his side, pulling the blanket closer, tucking his chin down the way Oliver had adjusted his collar. The gesture felt like copying a kindness, and that, too, felt warming. For a long moment he simply listened to the rain, to his own breathing, to the tiny candle sound. Each breath came and went, and his body began to loosen its careful grip on itself. The day, which had been tight and heavy, seemed further away. The night, which had begun as fog and weariness, had turned into lamplight and quiet care. Alfie's eyelids grew heavier. He did not fight them. Yet, as he drifted, a thought rose gently, one last, soft thing. He had wanted to deliver one last errand that left someone feeling safely cared for. He had done it, and in doing it, he had found that the city could care for him too, through a warm shop, a shared biscuit, a collar turned up against the damp, a note written briskly but meant kindly, through a tune restored, and a spring placed back where it belonged. The candle flame blurred. The rain's tapping became a lullaby with no words. Alfie's breathing slowed further, deepening, softening. His hands, no longer clenched around a satchel strap, rested open on the blanket, as if they had finally been told they could stop holding everything. And London, beyond his small window, continued to glow under gaslight and fog, continuing its quiet work of being a great city that sometimes, on rainy November nights, remembered how to be gentle. While Alfie lay there in his little room beneath the sloping ceiling, London did not stop being London. It simply softened its voice. Outside, the fog continued to settle like a shawl over the rooftops, and the gas lamps burned on, patient and steady, turning puddles into small, trembling mirrors. The rain kept its polite rhythm, tap, brush, whisper, never demanding attention, only offering its quiet company to anyone still awake. And there were still a few awake. Not far away, Oliver and the Artful Dodger walked on together, their footsteps light on the wet stones. They had left Alfie at the cracked blue door as instructed, and now they moved through Holborn with the easy familiarity of boys who knew which streets led to warmth and which led to trouble, and which led simply to quiet. Dodger had kept up his talk. At first he could not help himself, the words always wanting to tumble out like marbles, yet the night had gradually coaxed him into something calmer. His voice became a murmur, then a whisper, then only an occasional comment offered as if to keep the fog from feeling too lonely. "Look at that," he said once, pointing up at a lamp whose halo made the mist glow like pale gold. "It's like the lamp's wearing a bonnet." Oliver smiled in the dimness. "Everything looks gentler in fog," he said. Dodger made a thoughtful sound. "Aye," he agreed. "Even me." Oliver glanced at him, eyes warm. "You're gentler than you pretend," he said. And the words were simple, spoken as if they were an obvious truth. Dodger's shoulders lifted in a half shrug. "If you tell anyone," he muttered, "I'll deny it and then feel guilty for denying it." Oliver's laugh was soft, and then they were quiet again, listening to the rain and the distant hush of wheels. They passed the chapel lane, and Dodger slowed without quite meaning to. The gatehouse lantern still glowed, a steady little sun in its glass. Mr. Sallow sat there like a quiet guardian, shawl around his shoulders, his book open. He lifted his head as the boys approached and smiled at once, as though he had been expecting the night to send him familiar faces. "Back again," he murmured, pleased. Dodger put a finger to his lips with theatrical care. "We're whispering, sir," he said. Mr. Sallow's eyes twinkled. "London never sleeps," he said softly. "It only rests in short spells. Like a cat." Oliver stepped closer. "We walked Alfie home," he said gently. "He's safe." Mr. Sallow nodded, satisfaction settling in him like warmth. "Good," he said. "That boy's got the look of someone who carries too much." Dodger leaned in, as if confiding a secret. "He carried a tune," he whispered. "And then he carried, I don't know, something else, like he'd been given a bit of the city's softer side." Mr. Sallow's expression gentled. "A lantern can do that," he murmured, glancing at the light beside him. "A warm shop can do that. A kind word. Small things. Often." Oliver's gaze drifted down the lane, thoughtful. "Mr. Avery played the music by the gate," he said, voice tender. "It was beautiful." Mr. Sallow closed his eyes for a moment, as if listening with memory. "Aye," he said. "I heard it." His mouth curved faintly. Even the fog seemed to listen. Dodger's grin flickered into something quieter. "Fog's nosy," he said, "always poking its face into everyone's business." Mr. Sallow chuckled. "So are you," he whispered back. Dodger placed a hand dramatically on his chest. "Me? Never." Oliver smiled and looked to Mr. Sallow. "We should go," he said softly. "Good night." "Good night, boys," Mr. Sellar replied. "And mind your collars. The damp is sneaky." Oliver touched his collar unconsciously, and Dodger did the same with exaggerated offence, as though collars were insulting him. They drifted away again into the fog, their footsteps fading while the lantern continued to burn. Further along, they passed Fagin's shop once more. The window still glowed faintly, though the shop had quieted. Dodger paused, peering in as if the objects behind the glass might wave. "Think he's sleeping yet?" Dodger whispered. Oliver tilted his head. The bell did not jingle. The door remained shut. "Perhaps he's tidying," Oliver said. "He likes to put things away properly." Dodger sighed softly. "I like that shop," he admitted, surprising himself enough that he glanced at Oliver as if to make sure the confession hadn't been overheard by the fog. Oliver's voice was gentle. "It's a safe place," he said. Dodger's shoulders loosened. "Aye," he murmured. "Safes. Nice." They walked on, and the city kept them, quietly. Inside the curiosity shop, Fagin was indeed tidying, though his idea of tidying looked, to an outsider, like rearranging a world that had its own peculiar logic. He moved slowly now, not because he was tired, though he was, but because the night's work had left him pleasantly thoughtful. He set the tools back in their places. He wiped the magnifying lens with a soft cloth. He folded Mrs. Penfold's note again, then tucked it into a small ledger that lay beneath the counter, as carefully as one might tuck a flower into a book. "Keep that," he murmured to himself, voice quiet and amused. "It's rarer than a gold watch in a puddle." The kettle near the stove gave a faint sigh, as if settling. The embers in the stove glowed red and dimmed, glowed and dimmed, like a sleepy eye. Outside, the rain continued its polite tapping on the window. Fagin paused by the glass and looked out at the fog. The street beyond was softened into silhouettes, lamps like floating pearls, puddles like dark silk. He could not see the boys now, but he knew them, and that knowledge had its own warmth. "Alfie Crane," he murmured, as if tasting the name like a new coin. A messenger boy with careful hands. He thought of the way Alfie had held the music box spring, as if it were fragile and important. He thought of the way Oliver's kindness had steadied the room without ever becoming a performance. He thought of Dodger's quick talk and quieter heart. London, he knew, could be a harsh tutor. Yet sometimes on nights like this it offered lessons that did not bruise, only warmed. He turned back into the shop and banked the stove, closing its grate with the quiet satisfaction of someone putting a small son to bed. Then he blew out one of the lamps, leaving only a single light near the counter, a modest glow to guide him upstairs. Across the way, Mrs. Penfold had already locked her shop. She moved through the rooms above with practiced quiet, carrying a candle that made the hallway walls look soft and honey-coloured. The house smelled of paper and tea and the faint smoke of her hearth. She paused at the landing window, looking down at the street. Fog swirled in the lamplight. Rain made faint streaks on the pane. For a moment she could see her own reflection spectacles, pinned hair, the line of her mouth that suggested briskness even when she was alone. She thought of the music box in its cabinet downstairs, safe again among books. She thought of Mr. Avery's face when the tune began to play. She thought of Alfie Crane, shy as a mouse and earnest as a vow, holding the box as if carrying something holy. "Good boy," she murmured. And then, because she would have been horrified to be caught speaking so softly, she cleared her throat and went on. In her sitting room, she banked the fire, then set a book on her lap and read a page or two enough to let the words settle her thoughts into a more orderly line. The rain whispered at the window. The house creaked once, like an old friend shifting in a chair. Down the street, and through a few quieter turns, Mr. Avery made his way home too. He walked more slowly than earlier, not from weariness, though that was there, but from a kind of careful relief, as if he did not wish to spill the gentleness he carried. The music box was not under his coat now. It was not his to carry any more. Yet the note in his pocket felt like a small weight of permission, and that weight steadied him. When he reached his modest rooms, he lit a lamp and sat at his little table. The room was plain: a kettle, a cup, a few papers stacked neatly, and on the wall a small framed photograph or silhouette, his wife's face softened by time and candle smoke. He removed the note and read it again slowly, lips moving, as if letting the words sink deeper. Then he folded it back and placed it beneath the frame, like a small offering. "Well," he murmured to the quiet room, "it's not all gone, not everything." Outside his window, fog pressed close, and the gas lamps glowed. The rain was quieter now, as if it too were growing drowsy. Mr. Avery sat a while longer, not doing much, only being still, letting his breathing slow, letting the night settle around him like a shawl. He thought of the tune by the lantern, and he felt, for the first time in a long time, that the memory did not only hurt, it also warmed. Back in his gatehouse, Mr. Sallow turned another page and smiled faintly at some line that pleased him. The lantern burned. The city listened, and high up in his little room, Alfie lay curled beneath his thin blanket. The candle guttered low, his breathing deepening into that steady rhythm that belonged to sleep rather than worry. The damp of the night was no longer on his skin. The cold was no longer in his hands. The last errand of his day had ended not with exhaustion, but with a quiet fullness, like a mug warmed by tea. The rain tapped softly, then softer still. The fog held the lamps gently. The hearths across London dimmed into embers, and one small music box spring, no longer lost, rested where it belonged in the hidden heart of a tune, in a city that, for tonight at least, had remembered how to be kind. While Alfie lay there in his little room beneath the sloping ceiling, London did not stop being London. It simply softened its voice. Outside, the fog continued to settle like a shawl over the rooftops, and the gas lamps burned on, patient and steady, turning puddles into small, trembling mirrors. The rain kept its polite rhythm: tap, brush, whisper, never demanding attention, only offering its quiet company to anyone still awake. And there were still a few awake. Not far away, Oliver and the Artful Dodger walked on together, their footsteps light on the wet stones. They had left Alfie at the cracked blue door as instructed, and now they moved through Holborn with the easy familiarity of boys who knew which streets led to warmth, and which led to trouble, and which led simply to quiet. Dodger had kept up his talk. At first he could not help himself, the words always wanting to tumble out like marbles, yet the night had gradually coaxed him into something calmer. His voice became a murmur, then a whisper, then only an occasional comment offered as if to keep the fog from feeling too lonely. "Look at that," he said once, pointing up at a lamp whose halo made the mist glow like pale gold. "It's like the lamp's wearing a bonnet." Oliver smiled in the dimness. "Everything looks gentler in fog," he said. Dodger made a thoughtful sound. "Aye," he agreed. "Even me." Oliver glanced at him, eyes warm. "You're gentler than you pretend," he said. And the words were simple, spoken as if they were an obvious truth. Dodger's shoulders lifted in a half shrug. "If you tell anyone," he muttered, "I'll deny it, and then feel guilty for denying it." Oliver's laugh was soft, and then they were quiet again, listening to the rain and the distant hush of wheels. They passed the chapel lane, and Dodger slowed without quite meaning to. The gatehouse lantern still glowed, a steady little sun in its glass. Mr. Sallow sat there like a quiet guardian, shawl around his shoulders, his book open. He lifted his head as the boys approached and smiled at once, as though he had been expecting the night to send him familiar faces. "Back again," he murmured, pleased. Dodger put a finger to his lips with theatrical care. "We're whispering, sir," he said. "London's trying to sleep." Mr. Sallow's eyes twinkled. "London never sleeps," he said softly. "It only rests in short spells like a cat." Oliver stepped closer. "We walked Alfie home," he said gently. "He's safe." Mr. Sallow nodded, satisfaction settling in him like warmth. "Good," he said. "That boy's got the look of someone who carries too much. It's good he had company tonight." Dodger leaned in, as if confiding a secret. "He carried a tune," he whispered. "And then he carried, I don't know, something else. Like he'd been given a bit of the city's softer side." Mr. Sallow's expression gentled. "A lantern can do that," he murmured, glancing at the light beside him. "A warm shop can do that. A kind word. Small things, often." Oliver's gaze drifted down the lane, thoughtful. "Mr. Avery played the music by the gate," he said, voice tender. "It was beautiful." Mr. Sallow closed his eyes for a moment, as if listening with memory. "Aye," he said. "I heard it." His mouth curved faintly. Even the fog seemed to listen. Dodger's grin flickered into something quieter. "Fog's nosy," he said. "Always poking its face into everyone's business." Mr. Sallow chuckled. "So are you," he whispered back. Dodger placed a hand dramatically on his chest. "Me? Never." Oliver smiled and looked to Mr. Sallow. "We should go," he said softly. "Good night. Good night, boys." Mr. Sallow replied. "And mind your collars. The damp is sneaky." Oliver touched his collar unconsciously, and Dodger did the same with exaggerated offence, as though collars were insulting him. They drifted away again into the fog, their footsteps fading while the lantern continued to burn. Further along, they passed Fagin's shop once more. The window still glowed faintly, though the shop had quieted. Dodger paused, peering in as if the objects behind the glass might wave. "Think he's sleeping yet?" Dodger whispered. Oliver tilted his head. The bell did not jingle. The door remained shut. "Perhaps he's tidying," Oliver said. "He likes to put things away properly." Dodger sighed softly. "I like that shop," he admitted, surprising himself enough that he glanced at Oliver as if to make sure the confession hadn't been overheard by the fog. Oliver's voice was gentle. "It's a safe place," he said. Dodger's shoulders loosened. "Aye," he murmured. "Safe's nice." They walked on, and the city kept them, quietly. Inside the curiosity shop, Fagin was indeed tidying, though his idea of tidying looked, to an outsider, like rearranging a world that had its own peculiar logic. He moved slowly now, not because he was tired, though he was, but because the night's work had left him pleasantly thoughtful. He set the tools back in their places. He wiped the magnifying lens with a soft cloth. He folded Mrs. Penfold's note again, then tucked it into a small ledger that lay beneath the counter, as carefully as one might tuck a flower into a book. "Keep that," he murmured to himself, voice quiet and amused. "It's rarer than a gold watch in a puddle." The kettle near the stove gave a faint sigh, as if settling. The embers in the stove glowed red and dimmed, glowed and dimmed, like a sleepy eye. Outside, the rain continued its polite tapping on the window. Fagin paused by the glass and looked out at the fog. The street beyond was softened into silhouettes, lamps like floating pearls, puddles like dark silk. He could not see the boys now, but he knew them, and that knowledge had its own warmth. "Alfie Crane," he murmured, as if tasting the name like a new coin, a messenger boy with careful hands. He thought of the way Alfie had held the music box spring as if it were fragile and important. He thought of the way Oliver's kindness had steadied the room without ever becoming a performance. He thought of Dodger's quick talk and quieter heart. London, he knew, could be a harsh tutor. Yet sometimes on nights like this, it offered lessons that did not bruise, only warmed. He turned back into the shop and banked the stove, closing its grate with the quiet satisfaction of someone putting a small son to bed. Then he blew out one of the lamps, leaving only a single light near the counter, a modest glow to guide him upstairs. Across the way, Mrs. Penfold had already locked her shop. She moved through the rooms above, with practiced quiet, carrying a candle that made the hallway walls look soft and honey-coloured. The house smelled of paper and tea, and the faint smoke of her hearth. She paused at the landing window, looking down at the street. Fog swirled in the lamplight. Rain made faint streaks on the pane. For a moment she could see her own reflection spectacles, pinned hair, the line of her mouth that suggested briskness, even when she was alone. She thought of the music box in its cabinet downstairs, safe again among books. She thought of Mr. Avery's face when the tune began to play. She thought of Alfie Crane, shy as a mouse and earnest as a vow, holding the box as if carrying something holy. "Good boy," she murmured. And then, because she would have been horrified to be caught speaking so softly, she cleared her throat and went on. In her sitting room, she banked the fire, then set a book on her lap and read a page or two enough to let the words settle her thoughts into a more orderly line. The rain whispered at the window. The house creaked once, like an old friend shifting in a chair. Down the street, and through a few quieter turns, Mr. Avery made his way home too. He walked more slowly than earlier, not from weariness, though that was there, but from a kind of careful relief, as if he did not wish to spill the gentleness he carried. The music box was not under his coat now. It was not his to carry any more. Yet the note in his pocket felt like a small weight of permission, and that weight steadied him. When he reached his modest rooms, he lit a lamp and sat at his little table. The room was plain, a kettle, a cup, a few papers stacked neatly, and on the wall, a small framed photograph or silhouette, his wife's face softened by time and candle smoke. He removed the note and read it again slowly, lips moving, as if letting the words sink deeper. Then he folded it back and placed it beneath the frame, like a small offering. "Well," he murmured to the quiet room, "it's not all gone. Not everything." Outside his window, fog pressed close, and the gas lamps glowed. The rain was quieter now, as if it too were growing drowsy. Mr. Avery sat a while longer, not doing much, only being still, letting his breathing slow, letting the night settle around him like a shawl. He thought of the tune by the lantern, and he felt, for the first time in a long time, that the memory did not only hurt, it also warmed. Back in his gatehouse, Mr. Sallow turned another page and smiled faintly at some line that pleased him. The lantern burned. The city listened, and high up in his little room, Alfie lay curled beneath his thin blanket. The candle guttered low, his breathing deepening into that steady rhythm that belonged to sleep rather than worry. The damp of the night was no longer on his skin. The cold was no longer in his hands. The last errand of his day had ended not with exhaustion, but with a quiet fullness like a mug warmed by tea. The rain tapped softly, then softer still. The fog held the lamps gently. The hearths across London dimmed into embers, and one small music box spring, no longer lost, rested where it belonged in the hidden heart of a tune, in a city that, for tonight at least, had remembered how to be kind. The candle's flame, having done its brave little work, leaned lower and lower, until it was hardly a flame at all, more a soft glow, like a thought that has decided it no longer needs words. The room grew dim in the kindest way, as if the night were drawing a curtain gently, not to shut anything out, but to make everything quieter. Alfie's breathing had found its slow, steady tide, in and out, each breath smoothing him further into the mattress, each exhale loosening the last small knots of the day. His shoulders, which had carried damp and satchel weight and worry, rested now as though they belonged to a boy who had permission to be still. The blanket, thin but faithful, lay across him with a simple, reassuring pressure, and that pressure told his body, again and again, that there was nothing he must do at this hour except rest. Outside the narrow window, Victorian London continued to glow in softened fragments. Fog pressed close to the glass, turning the street into a dream of pale halos and gentle silhouettes. Gaslight pooled on the cobbles below, and the rain made those pools shimmer little mirrors trembling with quiet. Somewhere, far off, a lamp hissed softly as it drank its fuel. Somewhere closer, water slid from a gutter with a steady, sleepy persistence. The whole city seemed to be speaking in whispers now, fog and gaslight and rain, all agreeing to keep their voices low. If one were to drift, in imagination, along the lanes Alfie had walked tonight, the path would feel almost like a warm thread stitched through the cool cloth of the evening. There would be the sheltered bookshop step in Holborn, where a small piece of silver coil had waited patiently under the lamplight. There would be the gatehouse lantern by the chapel, steady as a promise, keeping a little alcove bright enough for comfort. There would be the Riverside Tavern's quiet corner, where a kettle simmered and steam rose like a soft, wordless hymn. And there would be Fagin's lamplit curiosity shop, warm with old wood and careful hands, where tiny mechanisms were treated as kindly as living things. Those places were still there, even now. The bookshop would be locked, its hearth banked, its shelves holding their quiet worlds. The tavern would be closing down, mugs rinsed, the kettle perhaps still murmuring for those who liked their warmth late. The curiosity shop would be darkened to a single lamp, then to none at all, its objects settling back into their patient hush. The lantern at the gatehouse would go on burning, because lanterns were made to stay, and because some lights, once kindled, seemed reluctant to leave anyone entirely alone. The rain, too, would go on with its gentle tapping, less a weather now, more a lullaby. It would brush the windowpanes and stroke the bricks and wash the cobbles clean, as if the city were being soothed into sleep the way a child is soothed by steady sound, by familiar rhythm, by the knowledge that someone is minding the hearth. And inside this small room, under the sloping ceiling, Alfie lay wrapped in the simple safety of having finished his last errand well. There was no parcel to deliver now, no message to carry, no street to hurry down before the bell changed its mind. The satchel sat quiet on the chair with its strap newly protected, as if even it had been told, "For tonight, you may rest too." His mind, already drifting, held the memory of the music box tune not as a sharp melody, but as a feeling of lantern light warming fog, a feeling of a circle closing gently, without scolding or strain, a feeling that small, careful actions could nudge the great city into softness, if only for a night. That sort of feeling did not demand anything of him. It simply lay within him like an ember, dim, steady, and comforting. If his dreams came, they would come quietly. They might be full of warm rooms and polished wood, of tea steam curling up through lamplight, of cobbles shining under rain. They might be full of gentle faces, Oliver's steady kindness, Dodger's careful directions disguised as mischief, Fagin's bright-eyed warmth among old treasures appearing not as startling visions, but as calm presences that made even fog feel friendly. Yet even dreams were not required. Sleep could be plain and simple, like a blanket, like a slow breath, like the softest note at the end of a tune. The city's sounds thinned further. Somewhere in the building, a door clicked softly. Somewhere in the distance, a wheel turned once, and then fell silent. The rain eased to a finer whisper, as if it too were growing heavy-eyed. The fog held the gaslight close, turning each lamp into a small, floating hearth in the open air. London, for all its size, seemed to fold inward, settling down as if it were one great, tired creature finding a comfortable position. Alfie's breathing deepened again, in and out, the rise and fall, gentle as a tide against a quiet shore. The muscles along his jaw softened, his hands stayed open, his feet, warmed at last, rested without twitching toward tomorrow's tasks. The pillow held his cheek with cool kindness. The blanket held his shoulders with steady weight. The room held him with hush. And if, in the far corners of the night, there were still lights burning, stove embers dimming in a back room, a candle stub near a book, a lantern by a gatehouse, it was only the city's way of keeping watch without making a fuss. Just enough glow to promise that warmth exists, even when the fog is thick. Just enough firelight to remind the heart that comfort can be found in small places. In a cup of tea, in a sheltered step, in a shared biscuit, in a tune repaired and returned. If these Victorian sleep stories bring you comfort, you're warmly invited to subscribe to Dickensian Sleep Story. And if you'd like, you can tell us where you're listening from tonight. May your blanket feel perfectly weighted. May your breathing stay slow and easy. And may the fog outside your window, whether it is London's fog or only the soft darkness of your own night, be warmed by the gentle glow of imagined gaslight and hearth fire until your thoughts drift away like rain on cobblestones, and you rest, safe and unhurried, as if the whole world has finally learned to speak in whispers. Good night.